Take a Ride with Me. The Philly Doctors Series, Book 1. Written by Kara Joy. Narrated by Kay Meyer. Chapter 1. Cesca, are you sure about this? Cecilia Ampah asked her only child as she threw the last suitcase into the Ford Hybrid midsize SUV. Cesca Ampah did not answer her. Her mother was her world and she was her mother's. But she couldn't stay here. Not after the way she'd been embarrassed. Just a year ago, she was engaged to one of the most eligible bachelors at her church and in her small hometown of Brookville, North Carolina. Vibrant, charismatic attorney Brian Hansen and sweet, introverted Cesca were high school sweethearts. They'd kept the flame going all through college and a long-distance relationship during graduate school. Brian graduated from law school while Cesca completed her nurse practitioner program. A year after they were done with school, they had both returned to Brookville, gotten engaged, and were excited to start their lives together. For as long as anyone could remember, Cesca and Brian had always been together. They were the kind of model citizens parents asked their children to look up to. By all standards, life was good for Cesca and Brian. Until 6 months ago. That was when everything Cesca had trusted and believed in went belly up in a matter of minutes. She couldn't stay in Brookville anymore. No thanks. She had tried, and she just couldn't. Somewhere in the midst of all the turmoil, this sudden turn of events had also dredged up bad feelings and memories for Cesca. The feeling that her body wasn't perfect, and her father's lifelong rejection of her were back in full force. Usually, her way of dealing with hard situations was to throw herself into church activities and repeat Bible promises that spoke of the Heavenly Father's love, even if her own earthly father had rejected her. Those Bible verses seemed so far-fetched right now. Of course she believed them, but right now she wasn't convinced those promises were for her. Maybe if she had been more slender. Maybe if she wasn't so average-looking. Maybe things could be different. A cool wind blew across her face, and Cesca instinctively rubbed her bare hands together in an attempt to ward off the slight chill that coursed through her body. It was the tail end of summer. The leaves were still green and lush, but there was now a slight nip in the mornings. Cesca gathered the light cardigan she was wearing tighter around her shoulders. It had been 6 months since everything went haywire. She had fewer weepy days. Her appetite was coming back, and she was beginning to see color in the world again. But it was time. The Christian counselor she had been working with had asked during their last session how Cesca was feeling about things. She hardly felt ready to move on, and she had admitted that. But she had also come to a conclusion through her counseling sessions that perhaps moving on meant she needed to move out of Brookville. The thought had come to her a couple of months ago and had continued to consume her until she acted on those thoughts and started applying for jobs outside of Brookville. The most attractive offer had come from the Philadelphia University Hospital. Philly was 450 miles away. Far enough that it was unlikely she'd run into anyone from her childhood there, but not so far away since she could be back home within a simple 2-hour flight. Cesca cast a glance at her mother, who looked completely dejected, her hands crossed across her chest. This is so hard to do, Lord, but I have to do it. A new job, a new city, a new life. If she was going to stay sane after all that had transpired, she needed to get out of here. Not even her mother's dejected look would change that. Mom, Cesca paused, looking at her mother's sad face and letting out a sigh she'd held in for longer than she intended to. Cesca tugged at her cardigan again, this time fastening the buttons to keep the slight chill out while giving herself something to do, so, at least momentarily, she didn't have to look into her mother's sad eyes. When she finished with the buttons, she lifted her head to look at Cecilia again. They had been through this same conversation for weeks leading up to this day. Averting her gaze, but still facing her mother, she focused on some spot beyond her mother's shoulder. Mom, it's best that I leave. Everything in this town reminds me too much of him. The pain has been too much. I need to go. I'm less than a 2-hour flight away. I promise I will call you every day, and I will come for Christmas. An errant tear threatened to stream down her face. Rats! If I cry right now, Mom will cry, and this is going to be 10 times harder. Swiping furiously at an errant tear threatening to course down her face, Cesca swallowed the painful lump in her throat. She had promised herself she wasn't going to cry. That plan was not working. Before she lost it completely, she quickly added, "And you can come see me in Philly too, Mom. I just need to go away for a little bit." That last part was sort of true. Right now, she didn't know if she would be coming back to Brookville or not. All she knew for sure was that she had to leave. Cecilia moved a few steps toward her only child and hugged her, holding on for dear life. When they separated, both of their faces were covered in fresh tears. Cecilia sneezed loudly into the tissue she'd brought from inside the house with her. Cesca held her mother at arm's length and rubbed the sides of the arms of her jacket. She steadied her voice as she spoke again. "Remember, I said I'll call you every day, and I asked Jemima to stop in on her way to work every day." Jemima Stockman was Cesca's cousin. At that moment, Jemima was walking out of Cecilia's house holding a shoebox Cesca recognized from their childhood. Older than Cesca by just a year, they had been close since childhood and practically considered themselves sisters. She hated to do this to the people who loved her unconditionally her whole life. "Well, since you insist on leaving us so badly, don't forget this." Jemima handed the box to her cousin. Cesca peeked in and smiled at the contents. Little trinkets she and Jemima had made during their playtimes as children were in there, as well as some pictures from when their mothers had taken them on weekend trips to Myrtle Beach during the summers. She'd completely forgotten about the box, but you could always trust Jemima to dig them up. Sweet memories of childhood, innocence, and being carefree washed over Cesca momentarily as she drew her cousin into an embrace. "I'm gonna miss you, sis." Jemima mumbled something about missing her too. This was hard, leaving everything and everyone she loved, but she would go crazy living in this town where it was hard to ignore the whispers. She was tired of people at church giving her apologetic looks. This move was necessary, and Cesca reminded herself as such. Everything she wanted to take with her was in the car now. She set the box of memories in the passenger seat of her vehicle. After a few more parting words, more tears and hugs, Cesca fired up the engine of the SUV she'd bought herself as a graduation gift from nurse practitioner school, and did not look back. Sundays were Zadok Cho's favorite day of the week. They always had been. As he helped to load dirty dishes into the dishwasher, he reveled in this fact. Not only was he able to spend the day in church with his whole family, which included 2 married sisters and their families, as well as 2 brothers who were still single and searching, there was always the family lunch that never disappointed. They were not a perfect family by any stretch of the imagination, but they loved and supported each other through all the changing scenes of life. One of those changing scenes recently had been Zadok's father's emergency surgery. After a routine checkup 11 months ago, doctors had discovered that his father's arteries were 60% blocked. The cardiologist and cardiothoracic surgeon on his father's case had advised that he needed immediate surgery and told the family that if the blockage hadn't been caught then, it would have ultimately resulted in a fatal heart attack one day, although he looked hale and hearty. Everyone had been so shaken, Zadok especially. He was a surgeon. How did he not catch the signs, even if they were subtle? Thankfully, the lead cardiothoracic surgeon on his father's case assured him that this was not something people could detect without specialized equipment. Nonetheless, Zadok had beat himself over it. Eventually, he had gotten over the guilt, and he had set up a prayer chain with some people from church instead. It had been almost a year since his father's health scare, and once again they could sit at Sunday lunch and laugh about life. They could tease each other and give each other warm hugs. Although his career as a surgeon was taking off, and he would never have to worry about money, Zadok felt richer to have gotten his father back and to be surrounded by people who loved and supported him. They had come so close to losing the patriarch of the family, and it had created a deep urgency in Zadok to love as hard as he could when he was around his family. He blew out a silent sigh at the memory as goosebumps covered his skin. "Uncle Zadok, look at this!" Zadok turned to find 4-year-old Xavier, his sister Destiny's first child, who was forever yelling for family members to look at his creations. Everyone suspected Xavier would become an engineer of some sort. He was constantly breaking down his toys to study the insides or running a crayon over something that did not need crayon color. Habits that had almost cost Destiny and her husband some precious household equipment. Right now, Xavier held up a roughly folded paper plane he had colored in bright crayon colors. Zadok swept his nephew into his arms and nuzzled the little boy's neck. He was rewarded with tiny squeals of delight and laughing eyes. As Zadok inspected his nephew's creation, he could also see where he had attempted to write his name, complete with an A that was upside down. Zadok smiled at his nephew. "Hey, bud, can you tell me what this is?" Xavier's enthusiastic response came as his uncle pulled one of the chairs in the kitchen and sat the boy on his lap. Zadok allowed his chin to lightly touch his nephew's curly dark hair as the child babbled on about something. Hearing the high-pitched voice of his nephew caused a knot to form somewhere deep inside his stomach. Again. Recently, he'd had this growing longing, a longing for his own family. A woman to love and children to fill his house. He wasn't sure how many he wanted, but he knew he wanted them. A rumbling warmth passed through his belly as the thought came to him again. He'd helped babysit his sister's children and knew how busy life could get with children, yet he looked forward to the day when he could hold his own child and hear the delighted squeals of children as he came back home from work. He looked forward to the day when a sweet little child, boy or girl, he didn't care, would demand his attention and heart like Xavier was right now. By the time Zadok broke out of his reverie, Xavier was announcing his departure. Zadok felt a twinge of guilt at the fact that he hadn't heard everything his nephew had said. Nonetheless, before he allowed Xavier to wiggle off his lap, he held the child close to his chest, squeezing him in a tight hug that caused his heart to lurch. Then, just like that, Xavier was off to find the next relative to proudly show his paper plane. His mind drifted back inward as he watched Xavier run as fast as his little legs could carry him out of the kitchen. He had dated a little in college and in medical school. He wasn't even sure if those counted as dates now. He chuckled lightly to himself. His asthma problems as a child and severe short-sightedness that called for thick glasses meant he was the awkward duckling amongst his siblings and classmates through his childhood and teenage years. Over the years, the asthma had faded into the background. He wore contact lenses now, so the thick glasses were gone too. All the physical activity of being a surgical doctor who walked and stood for most of the day meant he had also lost some of the excess weight he had carried as a child. Judging from some of the admiring stares some of the female staff now gave him at work, he figured he must have outgrown his awkward duckling phase, and now looked good enough to warrant attention. But nobody had really caught his attention yet. There had been a sweet girl in medical school who seemed to like him, but then Zadok remembered how the attempt to ask her out had failed miserably. He chuckled again to himself. It definitely had not been a laughing matter back then. But now seeing his large family and feeling the love that he got to experience each weekend, Zadok knew that he was looking forward to meeting the queen of his heart. Oh, brother. He didn't wax poetic often. He needed to find something else to do to distract himself from the fact that he had no queen. Zadok shook his head, amused at how his mind had gone down that road, and then refocused his thoughts on the present. Looking around, Zadok noted that most of his family was done eating, and that his sisters, their spouses, and the kids, as well as his brothers, had somehow all ended up in his parents' backyard as he had been daydreaming. He was all alone in the kitchen now. "You okay, baby?" came his mother's voice. He turned his head and looked in Audrey Cho's direction. Her deep chocolate-colored eyes shone with warmth, love, and years of wisdom. His father, Daniel, walked into the large kitchen dining area and wrapped his arms around her waist. He gave her a slow, teasing kiss on the neck. "Oh, stop!" Audrey half protested with a smile. Zadok's mom had been an international student from Ghana to the United States in the 80s. His father had been an international student too, and they had been in the same college. He was Korean. Initially, they had faced a lot of pressure when they announced that they loved each other and wanted to get married. Eventually, their families had accepted their love for each other. Daniel and Audrey Cho had now been married for 36 years. Zadok admired their passion for each other, even after all these years. Just looking at them, he knew he wanted this type of love too. The kind where he was still out of his mind crazy in love with his wife 36 years later. The thought was making him break a sweat over his upper lip, even though it was a cool evening. Reel yourself back in, Zadok. Spending time with his family always dredged up this longing in him, and recently the longing was getting deeper. Lord, this is where you work one of those wonders we read about in the Bible, and bring me a wife, he prayed silently. Zadok smiled at his parents, stood up from his chair, and finally answered his mother's question. I'm okay, Mom. The long shifts at the hospital put me in a daze sometimes. Even though this was the truth, it was not why his mother had found him transfixed to his chair. But he figured today was not the day for that discussion.
I'll finish up here in the kitchen.
He waved his right hand around the kitchen.
You and Dad should go hang out with those crazy people.
Both of his parents chuckled and walked to the large backyard, hand in hand. Zadok looked at them as he began to clean off food residue on the plates into the garbage. He smiled at his 60-something-year-old parents as they sauntered onto the patio in the backyard, and his father gave his mother a little twirl, which he executed perfectly.
One day,
Zadok thought. Chapter 2. It had been barely 2 weeks since Cesca started in her new nurse practitioner role. Philadelphia was the biggest city she had lived in. It was also perfect because nobody knew her here. A fresh slate, a new beginning. Just what she needed. Donna Abernathy, the grandmotherly administrative assistant for her group of family doctors and nurse practitioners, had already taken it upon herself to make sure she had fresh, homemade croissants and fruit on her desk every day. This was despite the fact that she had told Donna for the last week that she really did have breakfast each morning before work. The older woman who Cesca found out had been single most of her life explained that it was her way of making sure all you whippersnappers stay healthy after all the running around you do with these patients. It was Wednesday morning, and once again her adopted mother had dutifully placed the homemade croissants and a bowl of juicy strawberries on her desk. Cesca smiled and stepped out of her office to say her thanks. "Donna, you're so sweet," biting into the croissant and letting out the faintest moan when she realized it was stuffed with strawberry jam. Donna chuckled. "I knew you would love it, Miss Ampah." She loved it. Although it had only been 3 weeks since she'd moved to Philly, she was in love with her new home already. Her spacious loft apartment, which was about a mile from Center City, Philadelphia, had a gorgeous view of the Schuylkill River. She'd watched the lights of a few vessels sailing on the waters each night as she wound down for the day with a cup of chamomile tea. Her place was only about 10 minutes from the hustle and bustle of downtown Philly, and yet had enough suburban quiet for when she really needed it. She had finally tasted an original Philly cheesesteak, and it was not bad at all. So far, life in Philly was good.
Her croissants are why half of us still work here,
came the deep, unfamiliar voice behind her. Cesca turned to face a man who was good-looking by any standard and in any country. Suddenly conscious of the fact that a streak of strawberry jam had escaped to the corner of her lip, she lifted a finger to wipe it off. 6 feet. A few inches over her 5'9". Lean. He didn't seem muscular, but it was obvious he was into some kind of exercise. His white coat matched his teeth. His smooth caramel skin tone and curly ringlets of dark brown hair that seemed to catch the light of the clinic hallway were, well, gorgeous was the only word Cesca was coming up with right now. His eyes were brown, curious, and currently they were looking directly at her. She was also shocked that she had made such a quick assessment of the man in seconds. Must be all that nurse practitioner training. You had to be quick with assessing people's physical appearance, in case there was a fact they were not telling you. The handsome stranger smiled and waved at her.
"Hello, I'm Zadok Cho."
Cesca looked at him questioningly, but did not respond. She wasn't sure why she suddenly couldn't find her words, but it was happening.
My mom is black and my dad is Korean.
She smiled, her mouth still full of a half-chewed croissant. She was not sure why he felt obliged to include that detail, but it did explain the soft caramel skin color and rich dark ringlets of hair, as well as the gorgeous eyes.
I feel I have to say that each time because I look weird and my name always shocks people.
Sir, you're the farthest thing from weird looking. Cesca had finally swallowed that pesky bit of croissant and found her words. Cesca Ampah. I'm fully black. He chuckled. She liked the sound of it. Cesca shook her head slightly. He seemed nice, but she didn't have the luxury to be fraternizing with handsome men. Nodding and pointing to her slightly.
You must be the new nurse practitioner. Dr. Sanders told us you'd be joining, but I was on vacation last week and have been trying to catch up with work ever since I got back, so I hadn't had the chance to meet you. I follow up with the surgical patients and make sure they're still alive after they leave my operating room. You and I will likely share a lot of patients. A boyish grin crept across his face as he puffed out his chest, clearly proud of his work. Cesca was still staring at him, still perplexed that this handsome caramel man was talking to her. A surgeon, of course. Gorgeous man with a fantastic smile, wearing a white coat. Could he be any more out of a soap opera perfect? Cesca had to force herself not to roll her eyes at the whole scenario. It would come off as rude, and she wasn't trying to build that reputation. But the whole thing was cliché. What next? Prince Charming would come sweep her off her feet on a white horse? Come to think of it, she had seen his name as one of the consulting surgeons for the family medicine group she was part of, but she had skimmed many names that week. Up till this point, he had done most of the talking. She needed to do something to break the one-sided interaction. She stretched her hand to shake his. "Yes, I'm that nurse practitioner," she finally responded. She added quickly, "Dr. Cho, it was really nice to meet you. I have a patient in about 10 minutes. I'm sure we'll see more of each other." He took her hand in both of his, shook it vigorously, and flashed a blinding smile at her. A tiny warm tingle traveled through Cesca's chest as Zadok spoke again. "I'm sure we will." He let go of her hand and began to walk away. Cesca glanced over and saw Donna switching her gaze between the two of them with a healthy dose of amusement in her eyes. Shaking her head, she walked back into her office and closed the door.
It was now past 6 o'clock in the evening of the same day, and Cesca had just seen her last patient. This clinic was definitely more fast-paced than anything she had encountered in her career so far, but she was grateful for it. The busier she was, the less likely she was to think of the emotional turmoil she'd walked through over the last 6 months. By the time she had seen her last patient, Cesca was sure she would enjoy a good night's sleep when she got home. A glance at her fitness watch told her 2 things. It was 25 minutes past 6, and she had walked 15,000 steps. 15,000 steps. All that walking into and out of patient rooms will do that to you. A deep sense of satisfaction washed over her. No matter how hard the job got, Cesca was grateful that she could help people. It was all she'd wanted to do since she was young, and now she got to do it every day. The one part she didn't enjoy about her work was updating patient records. There were several to update this evening, and Cesca knew it would not serve her well to postpone this activity to the next day. Besides, with how many patients she had to see each day, she simply would not have the time to do them the following day. Therefore, she had started building the habit of staying an hour after her last patient to make those updates in the electronic health records system, so they wouldn't pile up. She closed her door to the chatter in the hallway and got to work. When she glanced up at the clock again, it was 7:30. She had been working steadily, and the only reason she had looked at the clock was because her stomach was growling so loud she was sure someone outside of her office would hear it through the door. Clutching her belly area, she tried to recall when she'd last eaten. She'd skipped lunch, and now she was more than grateful that Donna had dropped off the croissant and fresh strawberries on her desk that morning. How thoughtful of her. Even though that fuel had carried her through the day, it was now time to get some dinner. Turning off the computer, she began to gather her personal items so she could leave for the day. A gentle knock at her door came a few minutes later. She opened it to see Zadok Cho. He was no longer wearing his brilliant white coat, but the flashy white smile was intact. She smiled back. "Dr. Cho! Hi! Is there anything I can help you with?" Cesca gently chided herself for her voice, which now sounded an octave higher than normal.
"Please, call me Zadok,"
flashing her another one of the grins that had had that curious effect on her earlier, and shoving his hands into his pants pockets. He stepped fully into her office. In place of his white coat, he now had on a dark blue blazer that he wore over a white shirt that had the first 2 top buttons open and which was tucked neatly into dark gray pants.
"I was about to leave and noticed that your light was still on, so I just knocked to see if you were here. Are you headed out right now?"
It was almost fall, and it had been nippy outside in the evenings, so she guessed he might have made the deduction from the light faux leather jacket that had now replaced her white coat. "Yes, I'm about to leave."
"Me too. Do you mind if we walk to the parking lot together?"
Her first instinct was to tell him no. She didn't have time to walk to parking lots with anyone with a Y chromosome right now. As it were, she had been tongue-tied when she'd met him earlier. This was a season for healing and finding herself. Walking to the building where people stored their transportation devices with a handsome man smelled like a dangerous venture. She almost said no. Zadok must have read something in her face that communicated her hesitation.
"It's okay to tell me no. I just thought I'd offer."
His smile was smaller now, but his voice remained kind. In place of her initial urge to say no, Cesca gave Zadok a smiling nod. "No, it's not like that. Yes, we can walk to the parking lot together. Let me get my things, and then we can go," she responded. He stepped out of her office to wait for her. Tossing a few last items into her handbag, she switched off the office light and joined him in the hallway less than 2 minutes later. The walk to the multi-level parking lot was a mere 5 minutes. Zadok made small talk. She responded with short answers, working hard to avoid open answers that would invite more questions. He seemed to pick up on it and asked,
"How are you liking Philadelphia so far?"
"I'm loving it," she answered briefly, but truthfully. He then asked her where she had worked before Philadelphia City Hospital. She provided him with a vague answer about working in North Carolina, but wasn't specific. He had pressed on to ask,
"North Carolina is nice. I have an uncle who used to be a professor at a college in Durham. He's retired now. Which city did you live in?"
By this point, they had reached her car, and so she had an excuse to avoid his question. The answer to his question held a lot of painful memories, and she would rather not visit them tonight. Trying to mask her irritation at the last question, she turned to face him squarely. "Dr. Cho, Zadok, it was really nice meeting you today." He seemed to have taken the hint and dropped it.
"It was really nice meeting you too, Cesca."
"See you tomorrow, then."
"Yes, see you tomorrow."
The kindness had never left his voice or his eyes. Turning around, she opened the passenger's side of her car and dropped her bag on the seat. He stood silently as he watched her move onto the driver's side and start the car.
"Good night, Cesca,"
he said gently. Cesca regarded him with a nod, smiled, waved, and drove off. Zadok began to walk back to his car but couldn't help thinking about Cesca Ampah. He didn't believe in love at first sight, but there was something about Cesca that had drawn him in when he saw her at the clinic today. She was beautiful when she smiled, but she didn't do a lot of it, he'd learned from his brief encounter with her. In fact, when he chatted with her in the hallway in the morning and interacted with her just a few minutes ago, she seemed irritated at him. He could tell she wanted to say no to his request to walk her to the garage. He'd been about to leave when she acquiesced to his offer. He hadn't wanted to be rude and leave or make an already awkward situation awkward. Her eyes also looked sad? Tired? There was something in there that bothered Zadok, even if he'd just met her today. When he was within 5 steps of his dark blue Mercedes convertible, he slid his fingers over the unlock button on his remote control keys. He opened the back seat first to throw in his work backpack. He then slid his long frame into the driver's seat as he shut the door. Placing his hands on the steering wheel and gripping it tightly, Zadok looked ahead as other cars exited the parking lot. Whenever his work shift was over, Zadok sat in his car like this and took it as an opportunity to thank God for a productive day. Sometimes he would pray for patients or coworkers. Today, Cesca was fresh on his mind, so he decided to pray for her.
"Father, I don't know Cesca at all, and I don't know what she's been through, but I have a feeling she could use a reminder of your love. I pray that you comfort her if she's going through something hard in her life right now. I pray that she will encounter your love in a special way in her life."
Zadok went ahead and added a few more items to the evening's prayer. After a few more minutes of praying, Zadok ended with,
"And thank you, Lord, for your promises, which are true, and for answering these prayers. In Jesus' name, amen."
Chapter 3. It had been a week since Zadok had walked her to the parking lot. Although she hadn't encountered him again since that day, Cesca found herself thinking of the handsome doctor often. He was good-looking, and he seemed really nice. In fact, she had appreciated his attempts to be friendly to her. But as Cesca had reminded herself all week, she had no time for men or their shenanigans. It had been 7 months since the fiasco that would change the course of her love life. And if Brian, the so-called upright man she'd loved and adored for as long as she could remember, had done what he did, then she had lost complete faith in the male gender. She had tried many times to tell her brain this, but somehow and for whatever reason, her thoughts kept drifting back to Zadok. "Girl, it's your hormones." She checked her calendar. "My period is due in a few days. That must be it." She shook her head and touched 2 gentle slaps to her right cheek. "You don't have time for this." The thoughts kept running through her head as she rose from her desk to go make herself a cup of tea in the fully stocked clinic break room. It was still early in the day, and that cup of tea was key to helping her kickstart the day. Cesca prided herself on being practical and level-headed. It was the reason she had survived 4 years of nursing school and 3 more rigorous years of studying to become a nurse practitioner. She wasn't fickle. Everything she had done until this point in her life had been planned and calculated. Everyone counted on her being the level-headed, practical one her whole life. Everything had been going according to schedule until Brian ruined things. And now these thoughts of a man she had only met once were seriously throwing her off balance. Nope, you can't trust them. She could trust Jesus. She could trust her plans and practical nature, but men? No, thank you. She couldn't allow herself to go there. Wouldn't. All the males she trusted so far had let her down. And right now she was still healing, and she wasn't about to let another man come and sweep her off her feet only to abandon her when she least expected it. Ain't happening. Besides, a good-looking man like him was probably already taken, and so any foolish thoughts and fancies that he'd be attracted to her average-looking self needed to be squashed before she got carried away. And judging by the fact that it had been a week since she had seen him, or since he had sought her out, it was more likely he was only trying to be a friendly neighbor. A friendly neighbor who's a sight for sore eyes. Yeah, she was going to need to find some way to distract herself. Cesca entered the break room and went straight to the small sink to rinse her mug with more force than was required. She was still plotting how she'd stop the almost unwelcome thoughts of Dr. Zadok Cho when a cheery, familiar, deep voice spoke from behind her.
"Hello, Cesca."
Zadok. She turned to find him leaning against the door jamb. She let out a quiet and frustrated sigh. God, why? Yeah, he was easily material for the cover of those magazines in the grocery store checkout aisle. Dressed in a crisp, light blue Oxford shirt tucked into well-ironed, slim-cut dark blue pants, he looked every bit the successful surgeon he was. Hello, Zadok. How's your day going? I was just about to have a cup of tea. Want some? You're not supposed to ask him if he wants to drink tea with you. You're stone cold and unaffected by males, remember? She shook her head vigorously, as if doing so would get rid of her thoughts.
"I'm more of a coffee person," he started, "but tea sounds like it would be good. What type are you drinking?"
He straightened from his leaning position and walked to stand within arm's length of her. They chit-chatted for 5 minutes before Zadok mentioned that he had to get back to his office. As Cesca walked back to her office, her thoughts were racing. He's great, isn't he? Donna, the administrative assistant, said with a smile that made the corners of her eyes crinkle once he was out of earshot. Yeah, he seems nice, Cesca responded dryly. You know, each year since he's worked here, he buys presents for every child that is on admission on the pediatric floor on Christmas Day. He's always doing this and that to help people, and he's just so cool and nonchalant about it. Cesca stopped briefly at the door to her office and looked at Donna through the corner of her eye. Does he? The older woman nodded excitedly, and then turned back to her work as she added, Yeah, he's a real sweetheart. Great. He's a real sweetheart, too. Why couldn't he be a jerk? For the umpteenth time that day, Cesca rolled her eyes. She absent-mindedly took a sip of her hot tea. It scalded her tongue, making her wince. She finally decided that focusing on work would be a better use of her time and thoughts. She had patients to see, meetings to attend, a lot of patient charts to update, and absolutely no time to daydream about a certain handsome doctor. Several patients later, Cesca had decided to leave her door slightly open to let in the occasional chatter of the other clinic workers. Although introverted, the hallway chatter made her feel she was not in the clinic by herself, and that lent her some comfort. It didn't take her long to get lost in her work, a welcome escape from relationships past or imagined. 2 more patient charts, and then she would be done. Cesca sat up straight and stretched her arms over her head, letting out a soft yawn. She loved her work, but updating charts was just blah. Shifting in her seat to relieve the pressure she could feel from sitting down so long, she refocused on her work. 2 minutes later, she heard the soft knock. She glanced quickly at the clock on the corner of her computer screen. The time read 7:15 p.m. I sincerely hope it's not who I think it is. Yes, she replied reluctantly. The door pushed open, and Zadok poked his smiley face through it. Cesca allowed an internal groan to rumble through her chest. Why was he making it so hard for her to be stone-cold Cesca? The more annoying fact about the whole scenario was the unexpected warmth that had begun to rise in her neck area at the sight of him. Well, this is new. She was glad for all the melanin that hid the blush. She must have been looking at him oddly, something that seemed to have happened a lot since they'd become acquainted with each other.
Sorry, were you in the middle of something? I could come back,
he asked, uncertainty clear in his voice. Dr. Cho, Zadok, come on in. She motioned with her hands for him to step into the office. Have a seat. How did your day go? She smiled up at him. He made himself comfortable in the chair across from her desk.
Not bad, actually. I had back-to-back surgeries all last week, but today was just consultations in the office and follow-up visits. Much lighter day, which is always unusual for me. How about you?
The whole time he'd been talking, Cesca felt like a silly bobblehead toy, nodding and smiling. What bugged her more was why this man chose to speak with her and why it was affecting her despite the promise she'd made to herself months ago to remain unaffected by the male species. Mine was good too, she managed. I have 2 more patient charts to update before I leave for the day. That's what I was doing before you showed up. She nodded slightly in the direction of her desktop computer. Maybe that will make him go away. But no, he began to chat about the weather, mutual patients, and the news for several minutes. As their conversation continued, Cesca noticed that despite the awkward start, mainly on her end, it was easy to chat with Zadok. This was new territory for her. She hadn't had many friends growing up. It had just been her cousin Jemima and her best friend Steffi, who had gotten married and moved to Seattle with her husband. Even in college, she'd kept mostly to herself. Making new friends didn't come easily to her, but Zadok made it seem easy. He smiled easily. He leaned in to listen and looked genuinely interested when she spoke. He didn't try to interrupt. Most of the pressure she had felt at the beginning of their conversation slowly faded away, and she began to relax. They had only been chatting for a few minutes, but it felt like they'd known each other for a long time. And then, as if on cue, the room fell silent for a few seconds. Their gazes held for a second before Zadok averted his eyes to look around her office momentarily. He looked back at her, clearing his throat, his look serious all of a sudden. He straightened up in his seat and smoothed the front of his shirt.
So, Cesca, he began, I was wondering if you're free next Saturday. Uh-oh.
Why do you ask? She did her best to keep a calm, neutral face.
Well, I was talking to Donna, and she said you don't have any family in town.
Cesca noted a hint of nervousness in his voice. He seemed embarrassed that he'd revealed he had been talking about her behind her back. Cute. Before she could respond to his assertion, he continued,
And I thought it would be nice to welcome you, Philly style. We're having a baby shower for one of my sisters. She's having her 3rd baby. The shower's this weekend. Mostly family and close friends. It will be a lot of fun, and if nothing at all, you'll get to eat some good food and hear my mother tell embarrassing stories about us.
His bright, disarming smile was back on his face, and Cesca could help but succumb to the pull of his smile. She smiled back. How sweet. Before she could truly edit her vocal response, she responded sharply, Zadok, are you asking me out on a date? Cesca regretted it almost immediately. He didn't deserve that. She avoided meeting his gaze briefly. Cesca from 7 months ago would have never been so bold, but these days she was done with flirtatious games and needed to know up front. Being bold and stone cold was always nice in theory. Putting it into practice was much more stressful, not to mention embarrassing. When she looked back at him, his eyes had grown large, and the look on his face said he was not sure if his next answer would be the right one or not. He suddenly chuckled and tapped his thigh lightly, easing the tension that had built up in the room as a result of her question. He stood up slowly, still smiling. He didn't seem annoyed at her accusatory tone.
While it would be a real honor to ask someone like you out on a date, that wasn't my plan here. I actually invited Donna, too, and my friend Tim, who's an ER doctor, if that makes you feel better.
Oh. Well, this is embarrassing. The heat that had started creeping up her neck when Zadok had first come into her office was doing its thing again. It was for moments like these that she wished she had vanishing abilities. Before she could speak again, he said, But I guess since we will be going somewhere, and I am asking you, maybe this is sort of like a date. He shrugged lightly and looked at her. It must have dawned on him at that moment that perhaps she had other plans, because his facial expression turned apologetic. He quickly added in a calm voice, Look, it is okay if you had other plans. I just thought I would ask. He smiled, but Cesca saw the hint of disappointment in his eyes. He looked unsure of what to do next and began to turn around to leave. What time?
Huh?
What time is the baby shower? He paused and turned so he faced her fully.
It starts at 4 p.m., but I know my people, and it is likely most of them will start showing up around half past the hour. If you don't mind, I could pick you up so it's no hassle for you. I do want to help my mother set up, so I would have to pick you up earlier than 4 p.m. if you like that option.
That sounds fine, Zadok. So when would you like to pick me up? She responded primly with her chin up. Great save. The tense air around them dissipated. Look at you, making friends and arranging friend dates, her mind seemed to mock. She suddenly became self-aware and began to fuss with the pin she had used to hold up her hair in the morning. His full smile was back.
All right, I'll pick you up at 3:30. I'll need your address. Can you text it to me?
She nodded wildly as she reached for her handbag and grabbed her phone out of it. They exchanged numbers and she promised to text him her address. After that, the conversation seemed to naturally end and Zadok turned again to leave. Do I need to wear anything in particular? It's a baby shower. Cesca was pretty sure it would be fine to dress casually, but there was a part of her that still wanted to ask anyway. With one hand in the middle of opening the door, he turned and looked her over appreciatively.
I'm sure whatever you wear will be perfect. I'll see you then.
See you then, Zadok. Chapter 4. Zadok had walked a safe distance away from Cesca's office before he realized his palms were sweaty and had been trembling ever so slightly. He could hardly believe what had just transpired. He hadn't gone into Cesca's office to ask her to come with him to his sister's baby shower at all. In fact, he had no reason to be in the vicinity of her office. But after seeing her in the break room earlier that morning, he had not been able to stop thinking about her. Her naturally curly black hair had been held in a bun atop her head. He knew nothing about women's makeup, but she seemed to glow when he saw her earlier. And although her eyes always looked so sad, her smile earlier had been warm. Cesca intrigued him. She had been on his mind since they'd met in the clinic hallway, and a smile crept across his lips each time he thought about the way she had wiped away the strawberry jam from her mouth the day they met. It had taken everything in him to not stretch his hand and wipe it for her. Yes, he had been busy in the operating room the week before, but one of the main reasons he had stayed away was because he'd been thinking of her so much. One of the mornings before Cesca arrived at the clinic, he had bumped into Donna in the break room. That's where he had learned that she was single and had no family in town. And then this evening, he had gotten the strong urge to check to see if she was still in her office. Most of the clinic staff were done with work around 6 p.m., and typically about half an hour later, most of them had left. He'd hoped he would find her just like the first day they had met. He didn't even know what he was going to say when he saw her, but then they ended up chatting very easily. Asking her to the baby shower had shocked him too. And why had his pulse raced when he asked her? It felt so natural to ask. Her response about whether or not this was a date had honestly confused him for a second because even he wasn't sure if this was a date or not. But now she had said yes to his invitation, and he felt like making a fist and pumping it in the air. Z! Get your head in the game, man! Zadok's friend Tim Franklin yelled at him. Zadok and Tim were medical school classmates. While Zadok had grown up in Philly, Tim was a New York transplant who had made Philly home. They also attended the same church and hosted weekly Bible study groups for the singles at church. Starting in med school, they had made it a point to play some kind of sport together twice a week to stay in shape. Tennis or golf were their go-to sports during the warmer months, and then it was badminton and basketball during the colder months. With it being the beginning of October and the cold fronts coming in over the last few weeks, they had opted for a badminton game at the gym in Zadok's condo complex. Zadok shook his head at his friend's rebuke. Whack! He returned the ball coming his way. It wasn't his best, but this also wasn't the World Championships. Who says I'm not paying attention? He yelled back at his best friend of 12 years. Tim paused the game and walked over to Zadok, who was breathing heavily from the vigorous game they had been playing over the last half hour. That goofy look that's been plastered all over your face all evening. That's what is telling me you're not paying attention. What's going on, man? You're the sharpest player I know. You always play aggressively. Today you're playing like you have jelly for bones. He double-poked at Zadok's arm as he reached for his gym bag. Zadok chuckled. His friend was right. He hadn't been playing his best game tonight. It had been about a week since he had invited Cesca to his sister's baby shower. The big day was 2 days away, and he was nervous. He had no need to be nervous, but he was. He and Cesca were not even really friends yet, but he was drawn to her. And to make things worse, he had blurted out a non-date invitation to her and she had agreed. He was over the moon, but it was also messing with his equilibrium.
I invited this new lady at work to Abby's baby shower,
Zadok told his friend. There was no hiding such news from Tim. He grabbed his gym bag and began opening it.
Whoa! Which new lady? What? When?
Tim's eyebrows were raised to the roof. Zadok chuckled and chugged down a few gulps of Gatorade before he responded.
Calm down, Tim. We're not even really friends yet. We've just talked a couple times at work, but I found out she just moved here and she doesn't have any family in town.
Yeah, you're a real sucker for us lonely out-of-towners, you big softy. Tim laughed as he took a swig of water from the water bottle he had just pulled from his own gym bag. Zadok remembered when he'd first met Tim in medical school. Tim's childhood had been troubled, but he had a loving aunt who had taken him in and loved him like her own. Moving to Philly to attend medical school had been hard for Tim, but he and Zadok had become quick friends, and his family had quickly accepted Tim as one of their own. The family still joked that Tim was their sixth born. Zadok nodded and looked at Tim.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. You know, the shower is this Saturday, and I keep wondering if perhaps inviting her was a mistake. When I asked her to come, she asked me if it was a date.
Tim let out a loud laugh. It was one of the things he and Zadok had in common. They both liked a good laugh and never held back at the opportunity to tease each other.
And what did you say to her?
Tim asked, wiping his face with a large yellow towel, still clearly amused.
Told her it wasn't, and if it made her feel better, I had invited Donna and you.
You like her, don't you? Tim always got straight to the point. No sugarcoating or hedging. Zadok attributed it to him growing up in New York. Did he like Cesca? That was a question he had been trying to answer this past week, too. Why would he invite a practical stranger to his home and family? He'd never done that before. But asking Cesca to come had just seemed so natural. So far he had learned that while she seemed icy on the outside and looked serious all the time when she got to talking, she could be warm and interesting. As far as liking her, yes, there was a lot to like. He wasn't about to admit that easily to Tim, though. Instead of answering Tim's question, he offered,
She just seemed lonely, and I was trying to be a good neighbor.
Tim rolled his eyes, but said nothing. Zadok patted his friend's back.
Let's get back to the game, shall we? I promise not to be easy on you this time.
We'll see about that, Tim responded with a laugh. Saturday came. Cesca had fussed all morning about what to wear. She thought about telling her mother on their daily call that she was going out with a new friend, but then she decided against it. Zadok was just being a good neighbor. Nothing more. So why have you been fussing about what to wear since you woke up? She tried to convince herself that it was because she did not want to look like a mess in front of people she had never met. But even she knew it was only partially true. Her mind drifted to thinking about him again. Zadok was good-looking, he was friendly, he chatted and laughed easily. Not once had she felt uncomfortable in his presence. And it wasn't just his interactions with her. The janitorial staff, nurses, technicians. Everyone seemed to light up when Dr. Cho was in the vicinity. He had charisma. Had he always been this charming? The question crossed her mind as she pulled on a pair of dark size 14 jeans she had decided was going to be most appropriate for the affair. Although she had lost some weight over the last 2 years by trying the ketogenic diet and walking at least 30 minutes every day, Cesca was still insecure about her body. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made, she muttered the paraphrasing of the verse in Psalm 139 to herself. It didn't take away all the insecurities, but it did comfort her heart. She paired the jeans with a gray bodysuit with a scoop neckline she'd recently purchased and a baby pink faux leather jacket she had fallen in love with while visiting London one year. A black belt held the look together. Her accessories of choice included a delicate gold necklace and gold stud earrings. She wasn't one to use a lot of makeup, but she had recently fallen in love with tinted lotions that gave her skin an extra dewy shine. She squirted some of the tinted lotion onto a makeup sponge and rubbed it in a circular motion on her face, starting with her cheeks. Some mascara and taming of the eyebrows later, she was satisfied with her look. She decided to take a hot comb to her hair, straightening it and letting her thick, dark hair fall just above her shoulder, instead of putting it up in a bun like she normally did for work. By the time she was done, Cesca had convinced herself that she would have looked even more gorgeous in this outfit if her thighs were not so huge and the corners of her hips did not jut out so much. She didn't have enough time to dwell on the self-loathing thoughts, however. Her cell was ringing. It was Zadok. Cesca looked more relaxed than he had ever seen her. His worry all week that bringing her around his rowdy family would make her uncomfortable had long since evaporated. She genuinely looked like she was having fun and had been an active participant in everything, including the baby shower games. Zadok was pleasantly surprised that she held her own and didn't seem to need him once he had made introductions and the party was underway. A few times during the party, their eyes met, and a curious warmth which had first coursed through him when she had walked out of her apartment today looking so pretty would repeat itself. She looked and smelled wonderful. He hadn't been able to put a finger on the exact scent combination because, honestly, who cared about that stuff? But when he had gone back to pick a gift from the car after they had arrived, his car smelled like roses. He had tried his best not to look her way during the party, but his brain had a mind of its own. Each time their gazes met, they smiled at each other momentarily, and then each looked away.
She is gorgeous when she smiles.
He hadn't seen her smile as much as she had today.
Just straight up gorgeous. And those hips.
Zadok had stopped himself a few times today from thinking about or allowing his eyes to wander to Cesca's rounded hips. She always wore suit dresses for work, which she looked amazing in, but her outfit today took things up a notch. Phew, he blew out. He couldn't let his mind wander too much in that direction. He didn't know her that well, and their friendship was just starting. Luckily, there was enough activity to distract him from wandering in his thoughts. He was especially grateful for the distractions today. It was past 9 o'clock before his parents' house emptied of their guests. Zadok and Cesca had stayed behind to help clean up. By the time they were done, it was 10, and it was time to head back home. "It was such a pleasure meeting you, my dear," Zadok's mother had mentioned as they got ready to leave. Before they left, both Mama and Papa Cho enveloped her in bear hugs. The action had threatened to make her cry, especially when Papa Cho had hugged her and squeezed her hand slightly. Although she had never doubted her mother's love for her, Cesca never really had a father figure to hug her the way Zadok's father had hugged her today. The closest to it had been the brief hug she had gotten from her pastor at her church in Brookville. She felt deep fatherly love emanating from the man and had to blink away tears before she embarrassed herself. When they reached his car, Zadok walked around and opened the door for her. He had done the same thing when he picked her up earlier. While earlier on it hadn't elicited a reaction, his repeated gesture threatened to get her tears rolling. Although Brian had been a great guy, they had been together so long he hardly ever offered to open doors for her. Of course she could open her own doors, but she never minded if a gentleman did it for her. Zadok's simple action touched a part of her she had shut off for the last 7 months, a part of her she had promised she was going to switch off for a long time. Although this was the first weekend in October, the evening was a perfect 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and Zadok had let the windows of his dark blue Mercedes convertible down. Shortly before he had done it, he had asked, "Is it okay if I let down the hood? It's such a nice evening." Nice was an understatement. The evening was wonderful. Certainly not helping my plans to remain unaffected. Zadok let down the convertible hood, and although the wind whipped her hair this way and that, she loved every moment of it. Cesca let the wind blow in her face and was just enjoying the serenity of being carefree for a little while. To be honest, it had been a while since she'd let her hair down and just relaxed. It felt so good. Zadok seemed to pick up on the fact that she was enjoying the moment and said nothing for several minutes. The silence wasn't awkward, though. The air was light between them, one they both seemed to want to savor.
"Everyone loved you,"
Zadok offered, smiling and breaking the amiable silence. Cesca looked away from the window to him and smiled. His smile was so disarming. Made you want to tell him all your secrets. "I really enjoyed them too, Zadok. That nephew of yours, he's a handful." They both chuckled. He laughed from the inside, and when he did, his face was a study in joy. He told her even more stories of his rambunctious yet lovable nephew Xavier. By the time they had reached Cesca's apartment, she was in stitches with laughter. Zadok parked his car in the visitor's parking space at Cesca's building. He hesitated for a minute before turning off the ignition.
"I know it's late."
The time on the dashboard read 10:25.
But do you mind if we walk and enjoy the air a bit?
She didn't want the night to end either, and Cesca guessed that this was his way of stealing a few more moments with her. She wanted to steal those moments with him too, but she had a feeling doing that was a doorway to something she wasn't ready to explore yet. And so, as much as she was tempted to scream a loud yes to his invitation, she found herself saying, "That sounds really nice, but I wanted to head to bed early. I want to wake up early to catch the morning service at this new church I want to check out." Zadok lit up.
That sounds wonderful. I will join my folks for church later on in the day. Which one do you go to?
Cesca shared that although she hadn't found a church home yet, there was one within walking distance of her apartment that she'd attended for the last month. She had not made any friends there yet, but she enjoyed the Sunday fellowship. He smiled again, and that quick shiver she'd felt each time their gazes had clashed at the baby shower came back. Time to make her escape. "Good night, Zadok." She began to open the door before he had a chance to react. Her loudly beating heart must have made her temporarily lose her hearing, for she hadn't heard when he had gotten out of the car and closed the door on the driver's side of the car. Next thing she knew, he was out of the car, smiling and walking right next to her. He had missed the opportunity to open the car door for her. He wasn't going to miss the opportunity to walk her to her door.
What kind of gentleman lets a lady walk to the door by herself on their first date?
Zadok said playfully, wiggling his thick, dark eyebrows. Cesca smiled and shook her head. Feigning surprise, she returned the playful remark and touched her chest dramatically. "I thought this wasn't a date." He laughed at her acting.
Well, that is technically true, but this part of it makes it feel like a date.
By this point, they were standing outside the door to her loft apartment. Everything suddenly seemed to get quiet. Cesca spoke first. "Zadok, thank you for inviting me to spend time with your family. It genuinely is the most fun I've had in the last few months." The sad look he had noticed about her crossed her face briefly before she broke into a smile that twisted something in his chest.
What had happened to her to make her so sad? What can I do to make the happiness return to her eyes permanently?
He seemed to have gotten one of those answers today. Cesca obviously came alive when she was surrounded by loving friends. Thinking back over the day, he couldn't have planned for everything to go better than it had. His family was usually a joy to hang around, but today everyone had gone out of their way to make Cesca feel comfortable and happy. It made his heart swell and made him want to repeat the action often.
And I'm glad you agreed to come with me.
Before either of them could explain what was happening, Zadok had bent down and enveloped Cesca in a hug. At first he felt her body go still in response to his touch.
Oh no, I crossed a line.
But then a few seconds later she relaxed and wrapped her hands around his waist to hug him back. The scent of roses wafted to his nose and tickled his senses. Hugging her felt so good, and he didn't want to let go. But he knew at this stage in their relationship that might come across as invasive, and so he released her from his embrace and took 2 steps back. Cesca felt like someone had lifted her up and set her up on a soft, pillowy cloud. For a moment, her eyes closed, reveling in the after effects of their brief hug.
Good night, Cesca. I want to make sure you get inside safely.
Zadok's voice was low and full of emotion. She opened her eyes. He was now standing on the second of 3 steps that led to the door of her apartment. His hands were shoved into his jean pockets, and the street lights cast a glow that made him look even more handsome. She fished for her keys in her purse, calmly to mask the sudden shudder that was coursing through her body. She steadied her hand as she opened the door to her apartment. Turning on the front light, she turned to face him fully. "Good night, Zadok." When she had closed the door and leaned against it to steady her body from all the emotions that had coursed through her over the last few moments, it occurred to her that for the first time in several months, she had not thought of the terrible event that had ended her engagement and forced her to move to Philly. Chapter 5. The week after their first non-date had been glorious. Although Zadok had been busy with back-to-back surgeries, he'd made time to come and see Cesca at her office for the last 3 days, every day. They had also taken their lunch breaks together so far this week. And then there were the daily good morning text messages. Usually Zadok sent a comforting Bible verse and wished her a good day. Nothing flirtatious about them, but they made Cesca's heart sing. It was Thursday, and she wasn't going to see him today because he had an emergency surgery which was likely going to take 8 hours. Since the hospital they worked at was a level 1 trauma center in an urban setting, it was not unusual for him to get called into emergency surgeries. Although she had initially been disappointed by the prospect, the fact that her cousin Jemima was in town today for a one-day work conference put a pep in her step. Jemima was a pharmacist who now worked as a medical science liaison for a large pharmaceutical company. Her job required her to travel along the East Coast, collaborating with doctors on clinical trials for new medications. She had let Cesca know of the one-day conference she had in Philly, and they had arranged to meet at a Panera Bread near the hospital for lunch. Cesca was able to clear her schedule and leave work to meet with Jemima before she had to return to the conference venue and then fly home later that evening. Cesca thought about all that had changed since she moved to Philly. She had left Brookville in late August, and now it was the second week of October, just around 6 weeks, and although she was beginning to settle into a familiar groove in her new city, seeing someone from home, her cousin turned sister no less, was thrilling for her and the highlight of her week. "Well, you look mighty happy," Jemima chirped as Cesca walked into the restaurant and towards her. Cesca didn't respond and instead gave her cousin the biggest hug she could manage. "You have no idea how much I miss you guys," Cesca said mid-hug, not wanting to let her cousin go. "Oh, we miss you too, honey. How are you?" Jemima straightened the dark dress suit she wore as she retook her seat. They had so much to catch up on, and before Cesca noticed, an hour had passed already. Thankfully, she had let the clinic know she would be out for 2 hours, so there was still some time. Nonetheless, Cesca felt a twinge of sadness knowing that in about an hour, Jemima would have to leave to go and finish up her conference. "So, you didn't answer my question from earlier." Cesca knew which question her cousin was referring to, but instead she raised her eyebrows in mock surprise and acted ignorant. "You look happy. When you were leaving Brookville 6 weeks ago, I'd never seen anyone sadder. Your eyes had literally lost all color, and for weeks you walked around looking miserable." That was because I was miserable." "Yeah, I know that," Jemima shot back at Cesca in their usual sisterly way. "But what I'm asking you now is what happened between now and then to change your demeanor?" Cesca had been careful not to share about Zadok and her because she wasn't even sure if Zadok and her were a real thing yet. That uncertainty had not prevented her from basking in the joy the man brought to her life with his simple conversation and interest in what she did on a daily basis. "I didn't tell Mom yet." "So there is someone!" Jemima almost yelled, causing a couple of customers to turn in their direction. Leave it to Jemima to be animated over anything and everything. "Will you let me finish?" Cesca chided with a serious look. Jemima nodded and shifted to the edge of her seat, as if Cesca was about to reveal the mystery behind the Bermuda Triangle. "This guy at work, his name is Zadok. Well, he's really nice, and recently he invited me to spend some time with his family." Cesca shared about how warm and welcoming his family was, the comfortable friendship developing between them, and the fact that they had shared a handful of good morning and good night texts. By the time she was done telling Jemima about Zadok, her face was hurting from smiling so much. Even if this was not going to lead to a romantic relationship, she would still be happy with his friendship. At least that is what she'd been telling herself all week. She had been through one heartbreak. No need to repeat that story. "Sounds like you really like this guy. You guys are just friends?" Jemima raised an eyebrow as she took a sip from a freshly refilled glass of iced tea. Even if there had been a few moments where warmth tingled her insides when Zadok texted her or smiled at her, they really were just getting to know each other. So yes, friends was the right descriptor. Jemima lifted her arms in mock surrender as she teased. "Girl, I believe you. I'll just remember to be on standby for your instructions for my maid of honor dress." Cesca laughed dryly. It would be a long, long time till she was planning another wedding. A long time. It was Friday, and Zadok thought about his day yesterday. He was sitting in his office reviewing patient charts. After he had returned from the 8-hour surgery, he had been called into another emergency situation that involved a woman, no more than 30 years, who had been shot in a domestic dispute. Why anyone would pull a gun out on someone they loved was beyond him, but it wasn't his job to judge or ponder the actions of others. He and his team of surgical residents had worked diligently on the woman for 3 hours. The situation was critical, but it was likely she would live. He had been able to go home to catch about 5 hours of sleep before he had to be back at the hospital for another shift. He rubbed his hand over his face and took another sip of his coffee. The coffee had been hot at one point, but with him so focused on patient charts early this morning in preparation for procedures he had today, he had mostly ignored it. Wincing as the cold coffee slid down his throat, he decided a fresh cup would make his day go smoother. He began his journey to the clinic break room, half hoping he would bump into Cesca. Cesca. She was becoming a part of his daily routine. A favorite part of his daily routine. Their friendship had grown over the past week. He smiled as he remembered some of their conversations from this week. Cesca looked quiet and introverted to most people, but she was a joy to converse with when she opened up. They had talked about politics, world events, local events, their shared faith, especially the verses he sent her in the mornings, and to his amazement, sports. He guessed he didn't need to be amazed by that, but still it had been a pleasant surprise. He was a huge New York Giants fan, which always made him the object of football jokes amongst a Philly crowd. While she didn't particularly watch NFL games, she was conversant with what was going on in college football. Zadok glanced at his watch. It was 7 in the morning, and although the surgical staff were just beginning to come in, it was still quiet. When Zadok walked into the break room, his eyes met with a woman he least expected to see, Dr. Shara Davidson. Dr. Davidson had been a colleague with him at Philadelphia University Hospital until a few months ago when she snagged an enviable position with a well-known private practice that served rich clientele. Shara had been on his case to join the practice for months, but he had declined the invitation. Yes, working at this practice would mean more money and perhaps better hours, but he preferred serving in an urban setting where people didn't always have the money for medical care. Zadok! Her gray faux double-breasted dress was cut a little low on the neckline. Shara had never been one to hide her buxom gifts, nor did she hide the fact that she used them to specifically get men to notice her. She had on a long dark jacket that reached her ankles and wore expensive-looking pointy black shoes. Her silky strawberry blonde hair was in curls that cascaded down the sides of her face. Before he could react, she threw her arms around him in a lavish show of affection. Zadok, it's been so long. I was in the area and stopped by to see if you've changed your mind about joining our practice. She spoke to him in a breathy voice that made him feel uncomfortable. While they had never been an item, Shara had always had a crush on Zadok and managed somehow to sneak in hugs when he least expected it. Not wanting to embarrass her, he'd always simply pried her away from his body in the most gentlemanly way he knew how. In hindsight, he probably should have just reported her to HR for sexual harassment. Just as he was trying to wiggle himself out of her embrace, he spotted Cesca at the entrance of the break room. Cesca! Yes, he and Cesca were technically still friends, but he was drawn to her, and he had a suspicion she was too. Right now, he really wished he had reported Shara for sexual harassment when they worked together. He tried to read Cesca's facial reaction, but couldn't. Her eyes went wide. Spinning on her heels, she turned around and hurried away. Talk about bad timing. He was furious now, and it was all because of Shara. He didn't hide the fact as he turned to look at the blonde woman. Shara, look, I am so sorry. I'm not joining your practice. Please stop harassing me to join your practice. The next time you ambush me at work like this, I'm calling security to escort you out. His hand shook slightly as he dumped the cold coffee down the sink and walked out without making the fresh cup he'd come there in the first place for. Cesca's pulse raced. A tremor shook her hands. She walked straight into her office, closed the door, and set the cup she had intended to use for her morning hot tea on the desk. She then slumped into her chair and covered her face with both hands. She and Zadok were just friends, right? She had no right to him, and he had no right to her. And so why had something tight gripped her chest at the sight of Zadok embracing a beautiful woman who looked so pleased to be in his arms? A soft knock sounded at her door a few seconds later. Cesca? Cesca, it's me, Zadok. Go away. She didn't respond. He'd go away eventually. And he did. Many more staff were arriving at the clinic, and it would be awkward for him to stand there and keep knocking. Her cell phone buzzed on her desk. A cursory glance said it was Zadok texting her. Well, his messages would have to wait. She had a full day of patients and wasn't going to waste another second on an unavailable man parading as her friend. She turned her phone off and tried to refocus on the day ahead of her. By the time Cesca got home that night, she was exhausted physically and emotionally. Her day had been full of seeing patients, and it appeared Zadok was busy with surgeries because she hadn't seen him after his frantic knocks at her door earlier on in the day. As she entered her apartment, she allowed her work bag to drop right next to her closed front door. Like a zombie, she walked into the bathroom and mindlessly took off her clothes as she stepped into the shower and allowed the water to begin running. As the hot water cascaded over her skin, the tears she had been holding in all day began to pour. The memories of what prompted her to pack and leave Brookville came rushing to her all over again, as if it had happened yesterday. 6 months ago, Cesca had received a mysterious text message from a number she did not know. The person wanted her to call about her wedding. As odd as she found it, Cesca called and spoke to a woman who identified herself as Lily. Lily wanted to meet with her. Hello? Serial killers? Lily assured Cesca she meant her no harm, but had insisted that the information she had would be best shared in person. After much back and forth, Cesca had agreed to meet Lily at a busy Starbucks they both knew of. Cesca had also arranged so that they would meet in the middle of the day. A serial killer could not possibly be that brazen to harm her during the day with tens of possible witnesses. The day came, and Cesca waited for Lily as she sipped on a hot chocolate that seemed perfect for the mild spring day outside. It was a bright day with several trees beginning to blossom after the harsh winter Brookville had just been through. Cesca chose a spacious booth to sit in. Minutes after she had arrived at the Starbucks, Lily slid into the seat across from her. As Cesca looked the woman over, she noticed a slight belly bump, as if she was pregnant. She desisted from asking, however, not wanting to be rude. The other woman was gorgeous. Blonde hair that was styled in curly waves, large blue eyes. Even though she wasn't smiling, she looked like she would have a beautiful smile. Cesca figured she was maybe a size 6, size 8 tops. Lily spoke first. Hi. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. No problem. What's this about? All of this was odd and like something out of a spy movie. In Cesca's mind, there was no need for pleasantries and small talk. The whole scenario was baffling as it were. Lily skipped the small talk too. Cesca, listen. This was really hard for me to do, but I had to let you know. The other woman's eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and regret. Cesca was even more baffled. Just as the thought crossed Cesca's mind at the increasing weirdness of the scenario, Lily stated matter-of-factly, I'm pregnant with Brian's baby. What? Excuse me. What did you say? Cesca was not one to talk loudly, but it took everything within her not to shout in the middle of Starbucks. Besides, there were a handful of customers who actually had known her since childhood. News of her having a verbal altercation with another woman would travel fast. Lily looked apologetic. If Cesca wasn't mistaken, moisture glistened Lily's eyes as she bent her head down and sniffed. What do you mean? Cesca had asked again coolly, in spite of the shock that had elicited a burning sensation that was making its way up from her chest and into her face. I'm so sorry, Cesca, Lily finally spoke. I found your number in Brian's second phone the other day, and he had a picture of you and him as the screensaver. It was a picture of your engagement night or something. Lily sniffed and swiped at a tear. I was able to unlock it since he uses the same passcode for the other phone. You seem like such a nice lady, and I felt bad he had been leading either of us on. Cesca went stock still. Everything in the world seemed to go silent at once. A loud buzz assaulted her ears. All she could do was stare straight ahead like a zombie. Hello? Cesca? Lily seemed to whisper after Cesca had not said anything in a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Yeah, she responded weakly. Lily had carried on saying something after that, but Cesca had hardly heard her. The meeting had been brief, and Lily left shortly afterward. She had to give that to the other woman. She had braved her own discomfort to give her this information. Cesca, on the other hand, was frozen in place, her hands hugging the paper cup her hot chocolate was in. It took a moment for Cesca to notice she was shaking from the shock and fury of what she had just found out. Her face burned, and there was a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow. Brian was on a business trip and was due back in Brookville the following week. If she was going to stay sane and be able to carry on with work that day, it was going to be important that she composed herself at least till she got home later on. That evening, Cesca gave Brian a call. He sounded excited when he picked up. "Hey, babe, this is a nice surprise. Oh, I miss you. I can't wait till we get married because after trips like these, I would be looking forward to coming home and—" Cesca swallowed hard. The painful lump was still there. It took everything in her to finally speak. "Brian, I spoke to Lily." Dead silence. She could hear Brian breathing on the other end, but he said nothing. Their breaths were heavy on either side of the phone for seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. It was Brian who finally broke the silence. Cesca, when did you speak to Lily?" "Today." So it was true. She could barely manage anything above a weak whisper. Her whole body began to tremble. The hard, painful lump in her throat made it hard to swallow. Look, I'm sorry, Cesca," he said with a voice that suggested he wasn't completely sorry. "Lily and I were in law school together. We studied together, and to be honest, I never planned for it to happen. But one night after a long test, we slept together. And then after that, we didn't stop." She didn't know where it came from, but all of a sudden, Cesca found her voice. The painful lump seemed to have gotten smaller. "And you still kept in touch with her, even though we both came back to Brookville, got engaged, and planned to have a life here? You kept seeing her even after that?" She blurted a little louder than she had intended. "Yes." Well, at least he was being honest. Cesca could not stop the large tear that rolled down her face. It was promptly followed by another. The first tear she had shed since Lily broke the news to her that afternoon. How could he? After all these years of waiting for him, keeping herself for him, promising herself that he was the only man for her and the only one she would give herself to once they were married before God and men. "Brian?" "Yes, babe?" The audacity he had to use that term of endearment at this moment was beyond her. But she wanted nothing more to do with this man. Her voice was shaky. She didn't need to say it, but she did anyway. "It's over." Her mind floated back to the present. Seeing Zadok in that other woman's arms today had brought it all back. All of it. The feelings of deep betrayal, of time she had wasted waiting for a man who didn't love her. The feeling that Brian had chosen a gorgeous, slender woman over her. The woman even looked like Lily, for crying out loud. Violent sobs shook her shoulders. It was happening again. At least this time it was happening before her emotions were fully invested. That fact didn't blunt the pain, however. Eventually, she did get out of the shower and put on pajama pants and an old long-sleeve college t-shirt. She opened the refrigerator and closed it immediately. Nothing appealed to her. She'd lost her appetite. Walking over to the work bag she had dropped by the front door, she retrieved her cell phone. Just as she had suspected, when she turned it on, the phone buzzed several times with messages and calls she had missed since she had turned off her phone in the morning. Several were from Zadok. She plopped into the comfy armchair she'd picked up on Wayfair and punched in the passcode to unlock her phone. Her voicemail indicated 2 messages had been left. One was from Zadok, and the other from Jemima. Jemima! She had forgotten about the fact that her cousin had taken the red-eye flight out of Philadelphia and most likely was calling to let her know she had gotten home safely. She listened to Jemima's message first. Girl, why is your phone off? Anyway, this is just to let you know that I got to Brookville safely and cannot wait to hear how things between you and Zadok progress. Ah! Love you! Talk to you soon! She chuckled mirthlessly at the you and Zadok comment. What a fool she was. He was just being friendly, and you let your heart get involved. Cesca still didn't want to go through heartbreak one more time. She had enough of that in her life. So far, all the men, Brian and her father, who were supposed to have loved her unconditionally and been her protectors, had abdicated their roles. She had left Brookville for Philly to heal from that trauma and begin a fresh new life. Or at least that is what she'd been planning till she ran into Zadok. Oh, why, foolish heart, why am I so gullible? Another memory washed over her as a chill and sudden weakness assaulted her body. After Cesca told Brian it was over, she had deleted his number from her cell phone and blocked it. She blocked him on all her social media channels as well. He had tried alternate ways to reach her, like when he'd come to her house and refused to leave until she opened the door. She did not open the door for the 3 hours Brian waited outside of it. He had tried entreating her through her mother, her pastor, and a handful of mutual friends. He knew not to ask Jemima because she would have straight up tried to punch him. He sent numerous emails, each of which she promptly deleted. A week after all these attempts, Brian had finally caught up to Cesca in her office at the Beaufort Hospital where she worked as a nurse practitioner. She was in her office glancing over some paperwork when he walked into her office. She looked up briefly, a scowl growing steadily on her face till the muscles in her face hurt. She diverted her glare back to the paperwork, but was hardly paying attention to them. Brian, this is hardly the place or the time. She kept her eyes glued to the work on her desk. Cesca, would you just give me a moment? He sounded exasperated, tired, frustrated. He looked terrible, too, Cesca noted, like he had not been sleeping. His beard looked unkempt, and Cesca reminded herself that she did not care about this man. He was dead to her. She continued to fuss with the paperwork on her desk to avoid looking at Brian. He spoke up again. Listen, I spoke to your assistant out there, motioning to the door, and she said you had no appointment for the next hour. She's right, but I don't want to spend my free hour talking to you. By this point, Cesca had lifted up her head and was staring straight at the man she had once called sweetheart, with dark, angry eyes. Her breathing had become heavy. Her breathing was much heavier these days. In an attempt to steady her breathing, she stopped looking at him and directed her attention to the laptop on her desk. She began to respond to an email that required her attention. Brian was still standing in the spot where the confrontation had begun in her office. Their stubbornness matched. A few minutes into the thick tension in the room, Cesca finally lifted up her eyes from her work and gently folded her hands on her lap. She tossed him the dirtiest glance she could manage and rolled her eyes. His eyes pleaded. Motioning with her hand, "You may sit," was her curt invitation. Brian claimed the chair across from her. She looked straight at him, dark eyes still in place. Look, Cesca, I know you want nothing to do with me. I'm ashamed, and these past few days I've been praying that you'd find it in your heart to forgive me. These past few days, huh? Funny how you were not praying those prayers when you hadn't been caught. Her voice was elevated, and she made no attempt to hide the disdain in her voice. Cesca, listen, I have felt bad for a long time, but the truth is, I love Lily. He averted his gaze from her face to his hands and continued. And she is having my baby. And I think the right thing to do will be... Cesca stopped listening. This was not happening to her. This is not happening to me. Lord, this is not happening to me. Why would this happen to me? The girl who had played it safe and turned down every date in college and graduate school. The girl who was still a virgin and looked forward to giving that gift to her husband, even though many had said she was old-fashioned for doing so. The girl who had not given any other man a second look or thought for as far as she could remember. She had remained loyal when there had in fact been many great guys who had vied for her attention. No, this was not happening to her. Life shouldn't be this unfair. She'd loved him with all her heart. She had been faithful. She had waited for him, dreamed of a life with him, and now it was as if someone had cruelly opened up her chest, yanked her heart, and was squeezing the life out of it. Her body was numb. In spite of that feeling, she managed to rise from her seat and walk to the door. Brian's head was still bent. He was still speaking, but she had tuned him out. The sooner I tune him out, the easier it will be to get on with my life, she mused. With all the calm she could muster, Cesca opened the door to her office. She had heard enough. Brian lifted up his head when she opened the door. Without looking at him, Cesca declared in a voice that was strong yet hurt, "Brian, please leave. Leave and never come back." He had tried pleading, asking if they could be friends, but she wasn't having any of it. After seeing that she would not budge, Brian got up and left. He had cast a look of apology her way before he walked out, but she was staring straight ahead, and that was the last she had seen of him. That day, Cesca went home, threw herself on the bed in her posh little two-bedroom apartment in downtown Brookville, and cried her heart out. She'd cried until the muscles around her ribcage hurt. She'd stayed in that state for 6 hours and had missed at least a dozen calls, most of them from her mother. All her life, Cesca was the round girl. She was not slender and lean like most of the other girls in her class. She was the thick one, who was endowed with big thighs, wide hips, and round bottom that never seemed to go away even if she ate healthy and exercised. Her mother had always told her that her big thighs and wide hips were just as attractive as the lean, tall, slender girls in her high school class. "God made every bit of you perfect, darling," had been her words all those years while she was growing up. But even her mother's reassuring words had not been enough for her to build confidence around these features. It did not help either that certain kids in her class had constantly made fun of her features from as far back as she could remember. Back then, fitting into junior sizes had been hard. Then there was her hair, thick, curly, and almost impossible to detangle or straighten. Somehow, when Brian had started expressing interest in her during their junior year of high school, she felt that if a boy could look past her thighs, hips, bottom, and unruly hair, then those features must indeed be beautiful. She had worked hard to keep excess weight off by eating healthy and working out 5 times a week, and even then she had always toggled between dress sizes 14 and 16. Brian seemed to love her anyway, so she had taken that as a good sign. And then he'd gone and slept with someone else anyway, someone who fit the general cultural ideals of beauty. Well, forget him then. Then there was her father. Cesca's mother didn't talk about him much, but every time she did, she could tell her mother loved that man more than she let on. As far as Cesca knew, he had left them when she was little. Even though they were aware of where he lived, Cecilia had never included the man in their affairs. Cesca had tried once to reach out to him, but he was less than enthusiastic about the contact. The men who should have been there had abandoned her. Men couldn't be trusted. Simple and short. Following the breakup, the embarrassment of having to call the reception venue to cancel the wedding had not been easy. Although Brian had offered to help through third-party messages he relayed through her mother since she was not speaking to him, she had refused his help. Returning all the wedding favors and trinkets had been humiliating. For those things she couldn't return, she had thrown them in the trash. The humiliation of doing each of these things had been crushing. She knew it wasn't her fault, but she felt it was. Why couldn't she be thinner or more beautiful? Why did her Brian love another woman? Why wasn't she enough? These questions had plagued her for weeks until Pastor Fred recommended a licensed professional counselor to her. At first, she hadn't seen the point. But for 4 months, she had seen the counselor weekly and had learned some useful coping tools she hadn't considered before. She had a long way to go still. But she had come a long way too. Or at least, that is what she thought, till she saw Zadok in the position he was earlier that day with the woman who reminded her of Lily. As her thoughts drifted back to the present, Cesca wiped the moisture that now covered her face. At some point, she had gotten up from the armchair and thrown herself onto the couch. Tears were rolling down Cesca's face with the ferocity of a river running into the ocean. She hadn't eaten all day. She didn't care to eat. The phone rang a couple of times, but she didn't bother to answer. It occurred to her at that moment that she hadn't cried properly when her engagement broke off, and today it was all coming to a head. She remembered Kubler-Ross's famous stages of grief from nursing school. She wasn't really sure where on the spectrum she was now, but she was pretty sure this was the part of it where she finally got angry at what had happened. All those months of pent-up frustration, sadness, asking God why, and other emotions she could not identify came rushing at her. Her eyes were puffy with the tears she'd been holding in for months now. Soon her breathing became labored, and she realized she needed to sit up to catch her breath. Her hair was a matted mess. Shaking, she picked up her phone to notice she had missed 3 recent calls from Zadok. He was the one who had triggered this. Right then, Zadok called again. She stared at the phone as it rang. She didn't answer. She was in no state to speak with him. There was one item she had not returned in the flurry of returns she had made following the breakup. Charged with the emotions she hadn't been able to fully express for the last several months, she jumped off the couch with a start and marched across the large living area of the loft apartment into her bedroom. Turning at the door, she looked at the closet door, which was slightly open. With all the force she could muster, she swung the doors wide open. It made no sense why she had kept it. Maybe she thought that keeping it would lessen the pain or make all of this seem like a really bad nightmare. But this was reality, and it was time to move on. Brian was in love with someone else. She was not getting married to the man who had been her high school sweetheart. He was not coming back. He did not love her. And now it was time for the wedding dress to go as well. She stared at the beautifully beaded bodice ivory dress with embroidered detailing she had saved for almost a year to buy. Her breathing had steadied, but the rage was there. She could sell it and make some of her money back. But the thought of selling her almost wedding dress had never appealed to her. Walking into her kitchen, Cesca grabbed a knife and stormed back to the bedroom. With a weird sense of calm, she walked to the bedroom closet. She took the dress off its hanger and began to stab the dress with the knife. It began with slow movements and then escalated into frantic slicing until the dress was in shreds. For the first time in months, a dam inside of her, one she didn't even realize existed, broke. Tears and sweat dripped from her face, and a soft tremor ran through her from the top of her head to the tips of her toes. Leaving the heap of shredded dreams in her closet, she walked a few steps, dropped the knife, and collapsed onto her bed. It was as if the bed knew she needed it. It felt soft and seemed to embrace her in an effort to comfort her. And for the first time in over 7 months, with a tear-stained face and matted hair, Cesca Ampah slept like a baby. Chapter 6. On Monday morning, Cesca told Donna that she was busy and to not let anyone come into her office unless it was the president of the hospital himself. She went about her day seeing patients and working steadily for the rest of her day. She was living an introvert's dream and was only talking to the people she absolutely needed to talk to. She hardly mingled with the other staff anyway, so being detached from everyone would not raise alarms except maybe with Donna. As for Zadok, Cesca had actively ignored him over the weekend. They were not a real couple. He probably was dating someone else, and she wasn't going to let her heart get involved with an unavailable man again. All day, Cesca didn't leave her office until she had to. When she did go back to her office from seeing patients in the consulting rooms, she shut and locked the door so nobody would bother her. Zadok had texted her once that day, but like his calls and text messages all weekend, she ignored that as well. Zadok ran his hand over his head. He'd gotten a low haircut over the weekend. His day had been light. mostly consults with no surgeries. By all standards, it was an uncomplicated workday, and generally he would be over the moon for such a light day. But he wasn't. Ever since Cesca had seen him in the break room with Shara's arms around him, she had refused to pick up his calls or respond to his text messages. It would be awkward if he made the trip down to her office, especially since he had noticed her door had been closed all day. His mind went back to the day they had gone to his sister's baby shower. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, instead of just the 2 weeks it had been. His family genuinely enjoyed her, and although he had gotten a few amused raised eyebrows at the baby shower, none of his family had made things awkward for Cesca. And then at the end of the night, when he had hugged her, she had felt so warm and right in his arms. A thrill he'd never experienced had made its way down his neck as he remembered how her body had gone still initially, and then how she had shuddered in his embrace. He had never been so bold with a woman. Around Cesca, though, he didn't mind being bold. It had been a perfect and sweet evening. Then the week after was going so well till Shara showed up and put on a show he hadn't wanted to be a part of. He didn't need to be a genius to know that was why Cesca had been avoiding him since Friday. She couldn't avoid him forever, though. They worked in the same hospital. Plus, it would be awkward to go to meetings where they were both present. He needed to reach her somehow. He clasped his hands in front of him as he prayed to God for help. At lunchtime, he grabbed 2 lunches from the cafeteria and made the trek to Cesca's office. Donna stopped him. "Dr. Cho, Miss Ampah is not seeing anyone in her office today. I'm under strict orders to not let anyone in unless it is the big boss himself," she relayed in a wry voice. Zadok shook his head and blew out a sigh. Nodding in Donna's direction, he thanked her. The older woman shook her head sadly and returned to her work. Zadok clenched the 2 lunch bags in his hands. Fine. She could have it her way. This afternoon. But he wasn't going to give up. By 7 that evening, Cesca was exhausted. Cutting up the wedding dress the other night seemed to have burst a bubble that had been building up in her for months. She still didn't feel great, but she did feel as if she was now over a hill when it came to her recent heartbreak. She also felt stupid for allowing her pride to prevent her from socializing all day. Yes, she needed a day to herself, but she had been mean about it. She had heard Zadok talking to Donna outside her door during lunch. A part of her had wondered if opening her door and gazing into his warm eyes would have thawed the ice in her heart, maybe even drowning herself in one of his magical smiles. But pride had shut him out. She sighed. Being angry was tiring. At her desk, she held both hands in front of her face and bent her face in them. "Lord, I'm tired of being angry. Help me. Help me get over this hump, Lord, in Jesus' name." She lifted her head and turned off the computer as she gathered her belongings. A quick glance at her phone indicated that Zadok hadn't texted or called her again. That should have been fine with her since she'd been ignoring him all day. So why did she feel a slight jab in her chest? Ignoring her thoughts, she grabbed her keys and started for the door. Turning off the lights, she locked the door and then tucked the keys away into the work bag compartment she used to store her keys. When she swung around, her eyes clashed with Zadok's. He was sitting in Donna's seat and looking straight at her. Even with a death stare, he was crazily handsome. "Good evening, Cesca." Chapter 7. Her face went from tired to surprised, and now a scowl was quickly spreading. Yet Zadok thought she couldn't have looked more gorgeous. He couldn't help but notice that her dark brown eyes seemed to have lost the life he had seen in them last week. They stared at each other for several seconds. He got up from the desk and walked around it so he was standing a few feet from Cesca. Her eyes followed him. Her scowl stayed in place. He knew he had to handle this lightly, or else it could go awry. But he also knew he had to at least find out why he was on the receiving end of a cold reception after a pleasant start to their friendship. "I've been calling you." Cesca nodded and let her eyes drop to the ground. "I know." She adjusted the shoulder strap on her handbag, clutching onto it as if it would save her from his intense stare. "Shara and I were never an item," he started. She shot him a quizzical look. It occurred to Zadok that perhaps he needed to explain further. "The woman you saw me hugging in the break room the other day? Her name is Shara Davidson. Dr. Shara Davidson. She used to work here." He swung his right hand in a sweeping motion. Cesca said nothing as she stared straight at him with an expression he couldn't pinpoint. He continued, Shara had a crush on me a while ago, but I never was into her. She left to join a private network of doctors and surgeons, and she's been trying to get me to join them. She came here the other day to try to convince me to join them. When you saw us, she had just ambushed me with a hug. All I was trying to do was get some hot coffee to get me through the day. Cesca had now averted her gaze to look at something on the ground. What was she thinking? Cesca, please talk to me. She lifted her eyes up to look at him pointedly. There was fire in her eyes now. Zadok, look, you don't owe me an explanation for anything, she said in a voice that was surprisingly calm. You and we're not dating or anything, so what you do with another woman is none of my business. The words sliced through him. What she said was true. They were not dating. They were barely friends. But she had affected him whether he liked it or not. He still felt it was too early to share that just yet. He smiled. So, if we're not dating, and what I do with another woman doesn't matter to you, why have you avoided my calls and ignored all my text messages? Cesca rolled her eyes and started walking away. He chided himself. He had meant that as a joke, but it came out the wrong way. Maybe he didn't have to blurt that out. Me and my big mouth. Her walk was brisk, but his longer strides caught up with her in the parking lot. Just before she reached her car, Zadok yelled, Cesca, what I said was stupid and uncalled for. Forgive me. Cesca finally turned around to look at him. Her expression was softer now, albeit exasperated. Zadok, you didn't do anything wrong. I've just had some unresolved issues to work through. I'm happy to be a listening ear, Zadok offered, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets and adjusting the black backpack he carried for work. That's sweet, she responded quietly with a smile. Right now, though, I feel it's something I need to work through on my own. It doesn't have anything to do with you. If it had been anyone else, he could have just walked away and let sleeping dogs lie. But this was Cesca, and ever since the day he had laid eyes on her eating Donna's strawberry jam-filled croissant, he had known she was special. Right this minute, all he wanted to do was take her in his arms and make whatever had made her eyes so sad go away. But their relationship, if it was even that, was still so young, and he didn't want to do anything to jeopardize it more than he already had. But you will let me know if you ever need to talk, right? Cesca nodded and smiled at him shyly. Without a word, she resumed the walk to her car. He wanted to ask her so much more, but as he walked with her to her car, he noticed she blinked back tears. He wanted to ask why she was so sad. But again, he felt she needed space. Where was the manual on how to handle crying females when you needed it? They walked in silence to her car, each lost in their own thoughts, but keenly aware that the other person was beside them. Cesca thought over the scene that had just played out with Zadok. He wasn't dating Shara Davidson. He had gone out of his way to ensure she knew that, and if his persistent attempts to reach her were any indication, he had been trying to make things right since Friday. It was her stubbornness that had kept him out. When they reached her car, he stood back for her to unlock and open the car door. Cesca was not looking at him, but she could feel his eyeballs boring into her. Unlike the first day they had met, she did not walk to the passenger side of the car to drop off her bag and personal items. Instead, she hurriedly sat in the car and shoved the bag onto the passenger side with a mix of irritation and frustration. Lifting up her head, she saw Zadok watching her closely with narrowed eyes. Oh, how I wish he would stop doing that and just leave me alone. Okay, she conceded. Maybe not leave me alone forever, but just for today. She noted something else in his eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was a dare. Zadok Cho was not turned off by her cold behavior. Oh, he was not saying anything. But all of a sudden, clear as day, there seemed to be some kind of determination that had crept into his eyes and his features. He no longer sported the serious look he had when she had seen him outside her office. The corners of his mouth were curved into a slight smile and his chin was up. Shaking her head, she started the car and drove off. He waved. She did not wave back. He did not know where he was getting it from, but Zadok all of a sudden felt like he had a mission. He wanted Cesca to be happy. Not as a charity case. He genuinely wanted to see her be carefree and excited as she had been the day she accompanied him to the baby shower. This sudden urge was stronger than anything he'd ever felt. He didn't know what had made her so upset. He had no idea why she hadn't waved back. But whatever it took, Cesca Ampah was going to laugh and enjoy life again, and he was going to be responsible for it. With a sudden pump in his step, he walked to his car and started up the dark blue Mercedes convertible. Chapter 8. Why had she agreed to this ice skating outing with Zadok? It was a Saturday night, and they were out with Tim, Zadok's two brothers, Joshua and Caleb, and a handful of their friends. The whole affair was terrifying.
"You don't hide your fear so well,"
Zadok yelled at her as she held on the side of the railing for dear life while taking tiny little steps in the atrocious things they called skates. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Captain Obvious. The wide smirk across Zadok's face said he was amused. Cesca would have loved to find a snowball she could throw at him. Even though snow had not started falling yet, it was cold enough that some ice skating rinks were in full-blown business for the season. Her mother had been terrified of skating rinks and had often commented about not wanting to crack her skull open. So naturally, Cesca had never had the experience, something that Zadok seemed intent on changing. "You didn't tell me it was this hard," she protested. It was harder than hard. Her legs felt like jelly. Zadok was a skilled skater. He skated effortlessly toward her, his bright smile intact and his warm brown eyes boring into hers. "Hi," he greeted as he skidded to a stop near her and stretched his hand so that they were a few inches from hers. "Wow, you're gorgeous." She'd known that from the first day she had met him, but the fresh realization caught her by surprise. Cesca felt that familiar heat in her face in spite of the chilled air around them. "Hi," she responded, sounding winded. Maybe Zadok would attribute it to the fact that she was scared. He spoke again as he gently grabbed her hands. "Okay, fine. If you skate with me from here to the entrance right there," he pointed in the direction where a couple of kids were entering the skating rink. "We can take a break and go and get some snacks. What do you think?" Best idea she had heard all evening. She nodded and smiled up at him. He held her hand. "Don't worry. I have you, okay? Just hold my hand and we'll go slowly. All right?" Was this the voice he talked to his patients in? Because if it was, then she needed to feign some illness to see him. But said illness would need to have a surgical solution for the pretense to work. Oh well, scratch that plan. "Okay, I trust you," came her response. He flashed another smile at her before he began to move slowly with her. Once he had carefully led her to the rink entrance, he paused to help her get off the ice and onto regular ground. Their eyes held briefly as he did so. For those few seconds, it was as if everything was frozen in time around them. They were so close she could smell his cologne. Since she was no connoisseur of men's fragrances, she could only conclude that it smelled wonderful. He cleared his throat, drawing her out of her momentary daydream. "Come, let's take these skates off and find something to eat." In a matter of minutes, the skates were off and they were sitting in the small refreshments area next to the rink where people sat around tables in twos and threes. Zadok had gotten both of them Philly cheesesteaks and a couple of sodas. Sugar and fat. Just what she needed on a Saturday night. Once they had found a table, they prayed over their food and began to munch on their snacks like hungry teenagers. At one point, Cesca lifted up her head to find Zadok watching her while chewing on a bite of his sandwich. He seemed unfazed that she had caught him staring. "What's on your mind, Dr. Cho?" she asked, using the opportunity to take a bite out of her cheesesteak. "Your mind seems to run a mile a minute, like all the time. I'm curious. What are you thinking about right now?" "You. I'm thinking about you, Zadok." But she wasn't about to admit that. "Oh, this and that." "Do you miss home?" She did, but she was also falling for the city of brotherly love as well as some of its inhabitants. One inhabitant in particular. Despite the painful memories Brookville held for her, she did miss home. It had been home for 28 years after all. She had been planning on flying to Brookville for Thanksgiving. A part of her wanted to avoid the town altogether, but then there was the part of her that missed her family and wanted to see them. "I do. I miss home," she responded, taking another bite out of the cheesesteak.
You never told me what made you move to Philly, he asked as he swallowed the food he was chewing and sipped on his soda. His eyes were kind. Was she ready to tell her new friend why she had left Brookville? Ever since the day he had apologized for the scene with Shara, their friendship picked up again and was growing steadily. He continued to send her good morning texts. They had resumed taking lunches together, and now they spoke over the phone every night before they went to bed. Their conversations centered around work, sports, and sometimes politics. The conversations were always natural, never forced, and Cesca found it harder each day to switch off her phone when it was time to say goodnight. Rather than spill the details of her broken engagement, she said, "Brookville became stifling for me, and I needed a change of scenery. Philly seemed to check everything on my list when it came to the city I wanted to live in, so I moved here." He appeared to be content with her answer and didn't ask her more about her home. They chatted about other subjects until Tim, Zadok's brothers, and their friends came off the skating rink. It was now past 10 at night, and everyone agreed it was time they headed home. Zadok had picked up Cesca in his Toyota Highlander. Cesca had been shocked when he pulled up to her apartment in the bigger vehicle. He explained that he preferred driving it in the winter. Now, as they rode back, they were both quiet. He liked her. He liked her more than a friend. These past few weeks, their conversations stayed on safe topics, but the truth was he wanted to get to know her more. So far, he had succeeded in putting a smile on her face ever since he'd made the promise to do so. Did she want more than friendship too? The signs said yes, but he couldn't assume. It had been more than 2 months since they first met. Was that enough time to let her know he was interested in more than friendship? Was taking it slow the best approach? These were the types of questions that occupied Zadok's mind these days. So far, she hadn't told him of any past boyfriend. Maybe I should ask if she's dated in the past? He winced as he thought about how awkward that question would sound. He then reasoned that if she did have a boyfriend, it would be weird that she hung out and spoke with him so much. Right? Ugh. It was all so confusing. They had a solid friendship, and he didn't want to ruin it by asking the wrong questions. Through the corner of his eye, he glanced over at her in the passenger side of the SUV. She was looking out of the window, staring at the passing streets and buildings. He fought the urge to reach out and hold her hand. Taking a deep breath, he took his eyes off her to focus back on the road. His mind roamed the look in her eyes when he had told her to trust him to get her off the ice rink safely, and then again when he had helped her get off the skating rink and onto regular ground. The instinct to sweep her into his arms and plant a kiss anywhere on her face had been so strong. The one thing that had held him back was the fact that Tim would have fodder to tease him for at least a month. Why had he invited his best friend and his brothers for this outing anyway? In 5 minutes, they would reach Cesca's house and they would exchange goodnight greetings. All these weeks, that had been enough. He needed something more if he was going to take a chance at having a relationship with Cesca. A thought occurred to him. He would invite her to his church the next day. Clearing his throat, his voice broke the silence as he asked, "Hey, what do you think about coming with me to my church tomorrow?" Cesca turned to face him and smiled. Their eyes met briefly. "I'd love that." Her response warmed his insides, and again he was tempted to touch her. Phew! No wonder self-control was a virtue. Minutes later, they arrived at Cesca's apartment. "Wait!" he yelled as he hurriedly opened and shut his door and walked briskly to open hers. Handsome and chivalrous. Not that she was surprised. Zadok had stayed consistent since she had met him. He opened the door and promptly held out his hand to help her climb down from the SUV. Electricity arced between them as soon as she put her hands into his. Well, that's interesting. Had he felt it too? When he helped her down, he didn't let go immediately. Instead, he stared at her with a solemn look she hadn't seen him sport yet. Her heartbeat accelerated. "Did you have fun tonight?" He seemed unsure of his question, and her tongue was refusing to cooperate with her brain. She looked up into his warm brown eyes and was humbled by the adoration she saw in them. She averted her gaze as she responded. I did. I was a little scared at first, but you made it better." Warm vapor from her mouth fogged up the cold November air. He chuckled at her words as he pressed and rubbed his gloved thumb along her wrist. "Cesca, look at me." She lifted her eyes to look at Zadok as everything around her seemed to still.
Before she had time to do anything else, he bent his head to her cheek and kissed her there, and then almost immediately he gently brushed his lips against hers. When he lifted his head, she was shivering like a leaf, and it wasn't from the frigid Philly night. And all it had been was a gentle brush of the lips.
I like spending time with you, Cesca Ampah.
I like spending time with you, too. He let go of her hands and slid his hands into his jacket pocket. Cesca missed his touch already.
So, I'll see you at church tomorrow? Do you need me to pick you up?
Zadok said in a voice that sounded shaky. Zadok never sounded shaky. No, that's okay. I'll drive. Spending time with you in cars does confusing things to me. If he was disappointed, he didn't let it show.
Good night, Cesca. See you in church tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Z. She had heard Tim use the nickname. She hadn't meant to use it, but now that she did, she felt somehow that they had reached a new place in their relationship. Zadok grinned at her and waved as he climbed back into the Highlander. Chapter 9. After church with Zadok and his family, Cesca had gone with the rest of the family for Sunday lunch at Zadok's parents' home. She had enjoyed so much about Cornerstone Christian Church. The pastor, she couldn't remember his name now, had preached about forgiveness. Cesca had thought a lot about forgiveness since her engagement had ended with Brian, but today's sermon shifted something in her. The pastor preached out of Luke 11, where Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray. And forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone that is indebted to us. He reminded the congregation that while it was not easy to forgive, because of the sacrifice Jesus made for us and the fact that he forgives our sins every time we ask, a true disciple would want to forgive as well. Cesca had gotten stuck on the words true disciple and then missed out on the rest of the sermon. Or had she? Maybe that portion of the sermon was really what God wanted her to hear today. During the prayer time after the sermon, she had prayed that God would help her let go of the pain she held in her heart against Brian. She told him how she had been holding on to the hurt and disappointment even up until that moment. She also needed to forgive her father. Lord, I'm tired of carrying this burden. I'm releasing it into your hands. I let go of all the bitterness and pain. Thank you for helping me forgive Brian. And my dad, Lord. Thank you for giving me a heart that loves and trusts again. Her face was a wet mess by the time the prayer ended. Before she could dig in her purse to find something to wipe her face, Zadok handed her a couple of tissues and pressed his hands into hers. What had she done to deserve this sweet guy? Back at Zadok's parents' house, Cesca found again that while his family was in fact a rowdy bunch, the atmosphere of love was palpable. Something tightened in her chest as she watched Zadok and his brothers play indoor games with their nephews and nieces. Mrs. Cho and Zadok's sisters included her in every activity and conversation. His dad had offered her one of those world-class bear hugs when they had first returned from church. Is this what people mean when they say their hearts are full? Wow. Sitting at the kitchen island in the kitchen, she began to understand, perhaps for the first time, what that feeling of being full, of joy, of love, of belonging, might actually be like. Although she had a doting mother, she always wished for siblings she could bond with. Of course, she had Jemima, who was an only child, but this felt different.
What are you thinking about, Miss Overthinker?
The sound of the metal legs on a stool grated on the tile behind her as he plopped down beside her. And then there was him, the sweet caramel giant she was falling in love with. I was just thinking about your family, and how it's so big and loving. As she said that, Zadok's sister Destiny passed by and winked as she said, "Oh, don't be fooled. We're just putting on an act for you." Cesca chuckled at the humor. Destiny continued poking at Zadok's arm. "And let me tell you about this nerd here." And from there, Zadok could not stop the stories from flowing from his sisters and eventually his brothers and parents of all the trouble they had gotten into as kids. Cesca was laughing uncontrollably, and it was causing all the cells in his chest to do Olympic-level gymnastics. Since they had met a few months ago, it was the second time he'd seen her laugh that much. The first time had been when they had come to his sister Abby's baby shower, and he had regaled her with stories about Xavier's antics on the way home. He marveled at how time stopped when she laughed. Also, after the sweet pecks he had given her last night, he had been distracted by what it would feel like to take her in his arms and share a full-on kiss with her.
God, what do you think? Is she the right one? Should I talk to her about my feelings?
He needed to think. It was loud in the room with everyone trying to tell Cesca outrageous family stories. As he excused himself from the chatter that had now moved to the family room, Cesca looked up at him and smiled shyly. It hit him that he wouldn't mind waking up to that smile every day. He used the opportunity to use the bathroom. After that, he snuck out the back door of the home to take a short stroll and pray. He came back to his parents' house to find his sisters bundling up the kids to leave. His brother Joshua had already left since he had an overnight shift at the hospital as an internal medicine resident. Cesca and his parents were chit-chatting with his sisters, their spouses, and the kids while saying their goodbyes. He veered off into the now empty kitchen to get himself a glass of water. Leaning against the cool countertop, he noticed some dirty dishes in the sink and started loading them into the dishwasher so his mother wouldn't be stuck with all the work when they left.
You've been awfully quiet today, son.
His father's voice pierced his thoughts. He was usually the life of the party. Today, however, he had been drawn a lot more into his thoughts. He had been having trouble not thinking about a certain beautiful brown-skinned lady with thick black hair and an infectious laugh. All of the dirty plates and most of the silverware were now loaded into the dishwasher. There only remained a few large pots that would need to be hand-washed because they didn't fit in the dishwasher. Placing the last pieces of silverware in the dishwasher, Zadok wiped his hands on a dishcloth, powered up the dishwasher, and turned to face the older man. He peered around to see if anyone was listening to them before he asked in a low whisper, "Dad, when did you know that you wanted to marry Mom?" Daniel Cho smiled knowingly at his son and drew closer to him in case prying ears overheard them.
Is this about Cesca? Yeah. You want to marry her? I don't know yet, but you still haven't answered my question. How did you know that you wanted to marry Mom?
Zadok felt a strange heat rushing to his face as he asked the question. His father's smile was intact as he responded, "Well, if you ask your mother, she will say she fell in love with me the first day we met in psychology class. It took me a while to catch up to her, though." Zadok chuckled. He understood too well. His mother was definitely the more outgoing and direct of his parents, so he could imagine it. Daniel laughed too. Growing up, I never really imagined I would find love outside my culture. Didn't even occur to me. But then I met your mom, and she was fun, bubbly, and she loved God. She was perfect. She was patient with me, though. She became my friend for a long time before I ever gathered up the courage to tell her I was in love with her. Audrey Cho and Cesca entered the kitchen area just as his father's sentence ended. Daniel reached out for his wife's hand and drew her into an embrace. Audrey's face radiated pure joy. Zadok wished he could do the same with Cesca, but it would be so weird. Instead, he pushed himself up from the counter and said, "Cesca, I think it's time we left these two lovebirds alone." He was rewarded with a smile from her, the smile that did things to his heart. As they ready to leave, his mother pulled him aside as Cesca chatted with Daniel. When she was sure they were out of earshot, she straightened his jacket collar and wiped off an imaginary piece of lint like she used to when they were kids. Except he was now a full 7 or 8 inches taller than her. She looked him in the eye and spoke in a matter-of-fact voice. "She's an amazing girl, honey."
I noticed that too.
"Don't let her slip through your fingers." Also pray about it."
I will.
"That's my boy." She patted his chest. "See you next Sunday?" Zadok shook his head at his mother's simple yet firm directness. It was exactly how she had managed 5 rambunctious kids without breaking a sweat. Or at least, that is what Zadok thought. He bent down to hug his mother, squeezing her tight.
See you next Sunday, Mom.
Chapter 10. On Tuesday, a flower delivery arrived at Cesca's office. It consisted of the whitest, freshest roses she had ever seen. The fragrance coming from the flowers was delicate, yet it commanded attention. Donna poked her head through her office door with a mischievous smile on her face. "Who are those from?" Cesca wanted to smile, but it would totally mangle her imaginary street cred, so she kept a serious face. "I don't know, Donna." "Oh, dear God, that's not a lie, is it?" Donna scrunched her face and nose, deepening the lines around her face that told of her age, and which made her look like the cutest, most lovable person on earth. Well, open the card and read who it is from, then. Cesca couldn't hold back the smile now. Okay, fine. I will open it and let you know who it is from at lunchtime. Right now, I have to see a patient. Donna let out an exaggerated sigh, rolled her eyes, and mumbled something about Cesca being boring. Cesca chuckled and shut her door. She knew exactly who this was from, and the thought brought down goosebumps to her skin. With more patience than Job must have had, she moved away the paperwork that had littered her desk and set the flowers in the middle of her desk. The luscious scent of the roses wafted towards her nose as she sat down to relish the gift. Burying her head in the flowers, she allowed her senses to be assailed with their fresh scent. Smiling, she lifted up her head and located a small yellow envelope sticking out of the clear plastic holder that had been placed in the middle of the arrangement. Carefully, as if she had uncovered an ancient sacred scroll, she took out a handwritten note. The note was simple.
Good morning, Cesca. We haven't talked about what your favorite flowers are yet, so I got the roses. Hope you like them. Dinner. You and me, Friday night. Dress formal. It's a surprise. I'll pick you up at your house at 8. I can't wait. Zadok.
A blood vessel at her temple was pulsating. With trembling fingers, she put the note down on the table lightly, as if doing it any other way would disrupt the oxygen molecules around her. She smoothed down the front of her blouse and leaned back in her chair. That seemed to help her trembling fingers a bit. Her cell phone buzzed at that very moment. Without looking, she knew it was him. Zadok.
Did you get the flowers?
She hesitated. She didn't want to seem too eager. Oh, get over yourself, Cesca. She steadied her trembling hands so she could respond to his text message. Cesca. Yes, I did. They're gorgeous, Zadok. Typing bubbles immediately popped up on her screen. Zadok.
Just like you.
The goosebumps were back. Zadok.
And my note?
She closed her eyes, her breath caught. Cesca. Yes, I received that too. I look forward to dinner with you. Zadok Cho was asking her out on a real date. Just the two of them. To a place where she had to dress formally. Her heart was flip-flopping. Her face was hot. He was wooing her. And I'm enjoying it. By the time Friday night came, Cesca had been distracted all day. Apart from her high school prom, she hadn't been to any events that required her to wear a formal or even semi-formal one, and thus she owned none. After ending her day early, she went to the mall to find a dress. Somewhere in between running between the shops at the mall like Usain Bolt and burning 500 calories as if her life depended on it, Cesca realized that she wanted the dress to be perfect for Zadok. She hadn't been willing to admit it before, but yes, she wanted it to be perfect for him. After an hour of frantic searching through several shops at the Galley Mall, she finally found the dress she was happy with. A floor-length dark blue dress with lace and bead detailing that reflected the light softly. The sleeves and shoulders were made of see-through lace material, and the dress hugged her body in all the right places on her size 14 figure. Satisfied that this was the dress, Cesca paid for the dress and called an Uber to go back to her apartment. As she stepped out of the Uber, a glance at the clock on her phone said she had roughly 2 hours before Zadok came by to pick her up. A gurgling sound rocked her stomach. No time to eat. Sorry, tummy. You will just have to have an energy bar for now. After rushing into her apartment and downing the energy bar and a glass of milk in record time, she jumped into the shower and took some time for the hot water to massage her muscles from a day of being on edge about this date. A phone consultation with Jemima and several Pinterest searches later, Cesca found a hairstyle she liked. By the time Zadok called her phone to announce his arrival, Cesca was fully dressed up, complete with delicate silver jewelry. She twirled in front of the mirror before answering the call.
You ready?
As ready as I'll ever be, she said with a huge sigh. She could hear his smile when he spoke.
I'll see you in 10 minutes.
When she hung up the phone, Cesca spritzed perfume behind her ears and on her wrists. She smiled at her reflection and twirled again. It dawned on her then that she was smiling a lot these days. She was happy. The throbbing pain from months ago had dulled. She hardly thought about Brian or the broken engagement. She probably still needed healing in some areas, but everything didn't seem so dreary anymore. She'd be lying if she said Zadok hadn't played an important role in that. A quick touch-up of red lipstick finished the look she had worked so hard to put together. As she grabbed the dark clutch with silver details she had chosen for the night, she muttered a quick prayer. Lord, thank you for a good date tonight. In Jesus' name. Was that a prayer she could pray? She'd never prayed it before, but wasn't there a verse in Proverbs about trusting God in all your ways? Oh well, she had thought about adding, and show me if this is my husband, but had decided that perhaps that was pushing it. When the doorbell rang, she was ready for the evening. Cesca opened the door to a breathtaking sight. For a moment, she was transfixed. He looked suave in his dark suit, crisply pressed white shirt that was doing his lean figure justice, complete with a black tie that had pink stripes. He had gotten a haircut since she had last seen him. Virile and suave. A section of her brain was telling her to shut the door in his face and call it an evening. He looked like a movie star on his way to the Oscars, and she wondered if she was a worthy date. Before she could do that, however, he walked into her apartment and closed the door. Then, without a word, he took her right hand in his and kissed the back of it. Drawing her into his arms, he hugged her, and they stood like that for a long time. His aftershave smelled spicy and delicious, and so masculine. Dear Lord, I'm asking for permission to stay in this hug forever. Releasing her from the hug that had clearly affected them both, he held her at arm's length. You look gorgeous. His eyes were full of unbridled admiration and emotion. Why did he have to be so chivalrous? You don't look bad yourself, Zadok. He stopped, faced her with a look of mock surprise plastered across his face and laughter in his eyes. Not bad? Do you know how long it took me to have the tailor get this suit right so you'd find me irresistible tonight? Well, remind me to thank the tailor, then. Cesca shook her head as they both laughed. A few minutes later, they walked out of the apartment for their date. Nothing had prepared him for the vision Cesca was tonight. After they had left separately from his parents' house last Saturday, he knew he had to ask her out to somewhere special. So far, their dates had consisted of work lunches and time with his family and friends. While those had been wonderful, he wanted alone time with her. But simply texting her or calling to ask seemed so trite. He was pretty sure she wouldn't have minded. Cesca wasn't like that. No, he wanted it to be memorable. Thankfully, he'd gotten the idea to send her the roses and ask her on their first solo date from a TV commercial. That company was where he had ordered the flowers from, and why he was now on a date with the woman he had no doubt he was falling for. They drove together in relative silence, and just like many rides they had taken together, it was not an uncomfortable one. Eventually, they did talk about how their individual weeks had been and goings-on at work. After a 15-minute drive, they arrived at their destination. The sign for the Blue Sky restaurant was in a cursive font and glowed with a soft gold color. Since she was new to town, Cesca didn't have a reference for the establishment. She did, however, note that inside, other well-dressed couples were enjoying their meals. Zeta came around and opened her door. He took her hand and led her out of the dark blue convertible. He didn't let go of her hand. His eyes didn't leave her face until he had shut the door and had handed the keys to the valet. Once that was taken care of, he tucked her arm in the crook of his elbow and walked with her inside. Chapter 11. When the menu arrived, none of the meals had prices. The descriptions were delicious, however. Reading the menus reminded Cesca of how famished she was. In her quest to find the perfect dress and the anxiety that had elicited, she had skipped lunch. Everything on the menu sounded so good, and it didn't take long to find something she liked. Looking up, she found Zadok still holding his menu, but studying her intently. She spoke up first. Did you find something you like in your menu? Tilting her head slightly towards his menu.
Oh, there is a lot I like on today's menu.
And there was the embarrassing heat creeping across her face again. She looked him straight in the eyes and smiled. "Dr. Cho, are you trying to woo me?" Smilingly, he closed his menu, crossed his arms in front of him, and lifted them onto the table. His eyes had grown serious, but he still looked warm.
"I'm not trying, Cesca."
He looked straight at her and continued.
"I am."
When the food finally came, they both dug in hungrily and cleaned off their plates in record time without much fuss or small talk. She ordered a lamb dish that was served with rice and a curious but delicious sauce. He had gone for a salmon dish with potatoes on the side. Once they had ordered desserts, Zadok restarted the conversation.
"Okay, Cesca, tell me about yourself."
It was then that Cesca realized that after weeks of surreptitious glances and having her thoughts filled with him, she really had not told Zadok anything about herself. And apart from the bits and pieces she had learned through their conversations and the 2 visits with his family, she knew little about him. "What's there to know?" she started, unsure of where to begin. "Well, I was born in North Carolina. My mom met my dad while she was in college. He's never really been part of our lives." Cesca swallowed a small, hard knot that was making a stubborn attempt to wedge itself in her throat. She went on and told him more about her upbringing, her church and pastor of 20 years, Pastor Fred, who was quirky yet lovable. She talked about going to nursing school and then decided to become a nurse practitioner. Zadok's eyes never left her face, and it made her heart do many happy dances several times over. The waitress brought their desserts, and she stopped talking momentarily. He laughed at the hilarious portions of her story and stayed somber when it was serious. For some reason she couldn't explain, Cesca left out the part of her engagement breaking off.
"It sounds like you were so happy and settled in Brookville. I know I asked you this before, but something tells me there is more to why you moved to Philadelphia."
He was spot on, yet she asked anyway. "What makes you think that?" Zadok took a bite of his praline ice cream and pushed his bowl to the side. He leaned across the table towards her.
"Because, Cesca, every time I've asked you about home, you've had a sad look on your face."
Cesca shifted in her seat and suddenly found her fingers interesting. Her eyes moved down to the table for a brief moment. He leaned over and grabbed her hand from across his side of the table.
"I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to upset you. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to."
Sweetheart. He had called her sweetheart. The term of endearment caught her attention. Brian had never called her his sweetheart. It had always been Cesca. Here she was, still worried over a broken engagement with a man almost 500 miles away, and less than 6 feet from her was a man adoring her in ways she'd never been adored. She couldn't keep shutting him out. Zadok liked her. He had made it clear from the day they'd met. The least she could do was give him a chance. She decided that the first step to doing that would be to tell Zadok what had happened to make her leave Brookville. Lifting her free hand to her lips, she cleared her throat and began, still holding on to his hand, clenching it for strength. "I left because the man I thought I was going to marry got someone else pregnant and decided to marry her instead." She paused. He stayed silent. The soft chatter of restaurant guests and the quiet clatter of silverware against ceramic mixed in with the gentle bossa nova instrumental swirled around them. After a few seconds, she continued. "The part that hurt was that the woman he got pregnant was the one who asked that we meet. She didn't know about me either, and she felt guilty after she found he had been playing both of us." She lifted the glass of water next to her lips and took a big gulp before continuing. "When I asked him, he didn't deny it. I heard she gave birth a month before I left. I never dated anybody else. We were high school sweethearts. Or at least I thought we were." A wistful look crossed her face briefly. "Didn't give anyone so much as a glance because I thought I had met my Prince Charming, and we'd go riding into the sunset with our undying love. But obviously he didn't take it as seriously as I did." She paused again. She noticed Zadok's other hand was curled into a fist, and his eyes looked like he was ready to punch someone. Inwardly, she smiled at the protective way his body was responding to her story. Do you know what he told me the day he finally finagled his way into my office? She looked down at her lap. Zadok was still quiet. She lifted her eyes to meet his gaze from across the table. He told me, Cesca, I don't love you. He said he loved me like a sister, but had never been really brave to tell me until he met the other woman. She shuddered at the memory. That he kept on pretending after he clearly was in love with someone else knocked the wind out of me. So, just like that, our engagement was over. I had to return everything we'd bought towards the wedding. He offered to reimburse the financial investments I had made. I turned it down. After a while, I couldn't take the questions, the sad faces, or the pity everyone was giving me in Brookville. So I left. Zadok's eyes had not left her face all this time. His right hand was now softly stroking hers, and she felt warm and wonderful. His other fist, that had been increasingly curled up as she told the story, began to relax. He still wore a serious look, however. Phew, that felt good to let out. A weight had come off her the night she had sliced up her expensive almost wedding dress. Talking to Zadok tonight seemed to have taken whatever weight had been left from that night. She felt lighter than she had in months. Unfortunately, the weight that had rolled off her was now hanging in the air around them, in spite of the romantic atmosphere. Zadok's brows were furrowed, his lips were tight, and he looked more serious than she'd ever seen him. Cesca realized she needed to do something to break the heavy mood. Before she could, Zadok broke his silence. Do you still miss him? She paused to examine his question. Shaking her head slowly, she responded, No, Zadok, I don't miss him. If you'd asked me 2 or 3 months ago, I probably would have said yes, but right now, I don't. The taut muscles in his face relaxed a little, and they exchanged smiles. Hey, she touched his arm with her other hand. His eyes refocused on her. This was supposed to be a fun night. Let's forget about my broken engagement and do that, shall we? A broad smile brightened his features once more. So now that I told you my dark secret, how about you, Zadok? Why is a handsome, successful man like you not already taken? His features relaxed even further at her words, and the amusement crept back into his warm brown eyes. I've never been successful with the ladies. He ran his hands through the dark ringlets that adorned his head and smiled. I don't believe you, Cesca teased with a laugh. Oh no, it's true. I am a nerd. I mean, look at me. He dramatically waved his hand over himself and laughed. His laugh always sounded like music to her ears. I used to wear thick glasses to prove it, too. He continued, totally amused at his own narration. Because of my failures in that department, I just made school and pursuing a career my priority. I have a supportive family that has never put pressure on me to get married. So I guess I've been comfortable to just lose myself in work and wait till the right woman comes along. A tinge of heat hit Cesca's cheeks for the upteenth time this evening. Well, based on your performance tonight, you could have fooled me. Oh, don't be fooled. I asked my dad and brothers for tips tonight. The way he said that was endearing and disarming, which made Cesca wonder even more why Zadok hadn't already charmed 1,000 other women. They finished their desserts and chatted some more. The second half of their conversation was lighthearted and sweet. During their conversation, she noticed there was a tiny dimple on his left cheek when he smiled. How had she missed that? It made him even more handsome in her eyes, and she had to fight the strong urge to reach out and stroke said tiny dimple. By the time Zadok brought her back to her apartment, it was midnight. He offered to walk her to her apartment. She didn't turn down the offer. She did not want the evening to end. She had a feeling Zadok felt the same too. Throughout their dinner, they chatted easily, and there was hardly any tension. But right now, the air between them was tense and electric. They were finally at her door. She broke the awkward silence first. Zadok, this was so beautiful. Thank you for everything. His look had grown intense since they left his car. His brown eyes had gotten a tinge darker. Zadok, she started. Cesca, he started at the same time. They both laughed. She tilted her head to the door. Do you want to come in for some tea? She knew it was a dangerous idea to suggest, but she did anyway. Zadok smiled and swept both of her hands into his.
I don't think we should do that. It's late. We just came from a very romantic dinner. And there's this electricity between us. Are you feeling it too? Or am I alone in my feelings here?
I felt it too. She nodded shyly.
And that's why I can't come in.
Their eyes held for several seconds. He stroked her face with his right hand while he used the other arm to bring her into an embrace. She closed her eyes. He could feel her heart thundering just like his. When he spoke again, his voice was low and full of emotion.
Cesca, I'm going to kiss you. Is that all right?
Cesca stared at him. Her response came as a slow nod. He dropped his arm to join the other and brought her closer to him. She rested her hands on the wall of his chest. She felt so good in his arms. So good. He lowered his head and her lips parted slightly. He closed the distance between their lips and softly kissed her, sucking on her lower lip lightly. He felt her body shudder at the action and knew that if he didn't stop now, it would be hard to stop.
So this is how people feel when they fall in love.
Breaking off the kiss, he hugged Cesca and allowed his head to linger around her neck as he planted 2 more kisses on her sweetly scented neck.
Thank you, Cesca. This is hands down the best date I've ever had.
He whispered into her hair as he felt her shudder again. When they broke free of each other, he was smiling, and she looked like she was still trying to catch her breath.
Have a good night, sweetheart,
he sang cheerily as he turned on his heel to walk away. Cesca entered her apartment and watched him drive away. After he had left, she leaned against the door to study her wobbling legs. Wow. So this was what people went on and on about falling in love. Had she ever been in love with Brian? As she examined her heart, it occurred to her that while she had loved Brian, she hadn't felt this way about him. There was something richer with Zadok. A fat, wayward tear rolled down her face. This had been the most beautiful date of her life, too. Chapter 12. The ensuing weeks flew by. Thanksgiving came, and Cesca had to fly to Brookville to be with her family. It had been 3 months since they last saw each other, and Cecilia could not stop hugging her child when they met at the airport. Baby, I missed you. You lost some weight. Are you eating up there in Philly? Oh, my baby. As a teen, Cesca had always feigned annoyance at her mother's theatrical responses to perceived problems. At this moment, however, she was not resentful. She had missed her mother too and was happy to be around people she knew and loved. She and Zadok had been on a couple more dates since their formal dinner. They had also shared a few more sweet kisses that sent shivers down Cesca's spine each time. It was no secret at this point that they enjoyed each other's company. Very much. Zadok's schedule had been unusually busy over the past days leading up to Thanksgiving, however, and so they hadn't been able to spend time together. Nonetheless, he was an ardent texter. His last message to her that morning had read, "Have a safe trip. I'll miss you." He'd wanted to drop her off at the airport, but was called into an emergency surgery at the last minute. He'd called to apologize profusely and told her he would miss her. And then he had sent the text message just as she was about to board the plane. Cesca knew this was different. Zadok was special. But there was still that niggling feeling. Men cannot be trusted. It doesn't matter how nice they are. Cesca hadn't even been sure men like Zadok still existed. Was it for real? Zadok seemed serious enough, but her last relationship had taught her to hold her cards close to her chest. That's the only way you won't get hurt once he moves on to one of those Miss America types. She struggled with these thoughts as she listened to the announcement over the airport loudspeakers that her plane had started boarding. Her response to Zadok's last text before she boarded the plane had been to send a smiling emoji. She couldn't afford to be hurt again. The chemistry between them was good, but perhaps things were progressing too quickly? Baby, you're awfully quiet. Where's your mind? Her mother's voice interjected her thoughts. Cecilia was driving her home now. Sorry, Mom. I was just thinking. She placed her hands on the sides of her head and tilted her head from side to side as she rubbed an arm on the left side of her neck. Airplane flights always make me feel funny. Or maybe it's that boy that has you feeling funny. Cesca shot her mother a semi-shocked look and tried to say something. Cecilia chuckled. Jemima told me. He sounds like a fine boy to me. Do you have a picture? Her mother's amused smirk was still in place. Cesca shook her head and laughed in spite of herself. Yes, I have a picture on my phone. I'll show you when we get home. Home rolled around the corner in approximately 10 minutes. Cesca had arrived a day in advance of the holiday so she could relax and help her mother cook the next day's meal. It was going to be a small gathering that involved Cesca, her mother, Jemima, and a male friend Jemima seemed to be getting serious with, and Mrs. Potts, their elderly longtime neighbor, who had never married. Cecilia had unofficially adopted as her mother. This made her Cesca's unofficial grandmother. Intimate, sweet, and just what Cesca needed to recharge. Thanksgiving had been delicious and filled with so much family love. After dinner, Jemima snuggled with her male friend on the couch while Mrs. Potts slept in her favorite overstuffed armchair. Cecilia chatted with her daughter as they put the last dishes in the dishwasher. Cesca filled her in on the details about her job and, of course, Zadok. Baby, do you love this new man? She smiled and added, He's real handsome. Her mother's eyes looked dreamy. Great. She hasn't met him yet, and he's already charmed her. Cesca rubbed her hands together and rolled her eyes. Smiling shyly, she needlessly tugged at the hazel-colored sweater she'd chosen to wear for Thanksgiving. I don't know, Mom. I know that when I'm with him, I feel alive and warm. The night I told him about what happened between me and Brian was when I finally felt I was letting that drama go. A tear came down her face. Her mother was at her side in an instant and wrapped her arms around her just like she used to when Cesca had run home from school after someone had made fun of her weight. Oh, Mom, he is so sweet to me. I'm just so afraid. Her mother released her from the hug and looked at Cesca quizzically. What are you afraid of, Cesca? Well, my father left us. Brian left me. What's to say Zadok won't leave as well? Cecilia dropped her hands from holding her daughter. Her face took on a sad look. Motioning for Cesca to sit down at the round kitchen table that was as old as Cesca, they both sat down. Cesca sobbed softly as her mother held her hand and stroked it softly. I'm going to make us some tea, Cecilia said emphatically after a few minutes. Minutes later, with 2 steaming cups of tea, Cecilia came back to that round table, setting 1 cup in front of Cesca and saving the other for herself. Cecilia wrapped her hands around her mug and stared thoughtfully at a spot beyond Cesca before she began to speak. Cesca, I realize I've never talked about why your father left. As you know, he has never been a part of our lives, and mostly that was my fault. Cesca looked at her mother quizzically. Your fault, Mom? Yes, my fault. You see, your father was madly in love with this out-of-town girl, and he wanted to marry her. I had known him my whole life and had a crush on him since my teens. We were good friends, and it felt unfair that after I had been his friend and confidant sometimes, he would fall in love with this girl who had moved into Brookville with her family. Cecilia paused to take a gulp of her tea. Well, when he told me he was thinking of going steady with the other girl, I... Cesca looked at her mother incredulously. Mom, what happened? Cesca, baby, I seduced him. I don't even know where it came from, but I got your father to sleep with me. In the back of a car, no less. That's when you got pregnant with me? Cesca said in a near whisper. Yes, baby. That's when I got pregnant with you. Brookville was a much smaller town back then. Everyone found out. Including the girl my father loved. Cecilia nodded. Yes, she found out, and she would have nothing to do with your father. In turn, your father got mad at me and told me he did not want to be part of our lives. He has always worked hard to send child support, but because of what I did, he never wanted anything to do with us. Cesca leaned back in her chair and stared straight ahead. Her mother continued. So, yes, in the strictest sense of the word, your father abandoned you and never sought to be part of your life. But it was because of what I did. Cecilia's eyes were full of emotion as she took another gulp of tea and looked ahead at some point in the distance. Yes, I got you, my pride and joy, out of the whole thing. But I don't want you to hate him or let him be the reason you don't find love in your life. I made a mistake, Cesca. You don't have to pay for it the rest of your life. Do you understand? Cesca was looking down at her cup. Tears were flowing freely at this point. Baby, I am so sorry, her mother offered in a tearful voice. She reached out to hold her daughter's hand. Cesca held on to it for dear life. Letting out a huge sigh, Cesca finally spoke. It's all right, Mom. Like you said, you got me, even if your actions did not have the best intentions. I know that God had a purpose for my life. They both fell silent for minutes that seemed to stretch for a while. Thank you, Mom, for sharing this with me. Cesca got up, swiped at the tears on her face, and hugged her mother. Her father had left them because of her mother's actions, but he had made sure she was taken care of financially. That was enough for Cesca. It also reminded her of the fact that Almighty God was the ultimate caretaker after all. It was Sunday after Thanksgiving, and Cesca had joined her family for the morning church service. She was leaving for Philly afterwards. Don't look now, but I see your old flame heading our way with his wife. Jemima chimed in with a side eye after the service. Cesca did everything not to chuckle at the look on Jemima's face. Don't call him my old flame. He has a name. Cesca shot back at her cousin. Also, remember how Jesus said we should forgive. Jemima's face sombered. Yeah, you're right. But girl, I'm asking Jesus about that when we get to heaven, because some folks, well, it is hard to forgive them. Jemima faked a pout that made Cesca chuckle. Thankfully, the encounter with Brian and Lily was not prolonged. He had simply nodded in their general direction and walked on. Lily was busy pushing a child that looked to be about 3 or 4 months in a stroller and must not have noticed her. As far as Cesca was concerned, that was all the interaction they needed. He was married to the woman he loved, and she was moving on. A few minutes after the encounter, as she and Jemima walked towards Cecilia's car, Cesca realized that neither the gripping tightness in her chest nor the painful knot that had been in her throat in the weeks following the breakup had been there when she saw Brian and his new wife today. In fact, a part of her felt happy he didn't need to pretend to love her anymore. Progress. As her Thanksgiving visit came to an end, Cesca realized that while the trip to see her mother had been refreshing, not to mention revealing, she did not miss the small town she'd grown up in. Her flight back to Philadelphia was in an hour. As she threw one last item of clothing into her suitcase and zipped it up, she smiled. Just a few months ago, she had moved to Philly a nervous wreck, and now here she was, her heart well on its way to recovery. She had even faced the cause of her pain and had not felt the bodily manifestations of pain that had marked those early breakup days. It did feel a little odd seeing Brian with someone else, but that must have been because they had been together so long. That night in the closet with the knife and the wedding dress had proven to be cathartic. Very cathartic indeed. She straightened and looked out of the bedroom window. The leaves were a pretty golden color. Most of them had fallen to the ground. Golden rays of Sunday sun bounced off them elegantly and gave the world a pretty orange tint. The sounds of children playing on the same street she had played on as a child reached her. She had loved it here once. Everything was familiar and would always have a precious place in her heart. But for now, this was her past. Her mother's voice calling her name from downstairs snapped Cesca out of her reverie. She finished zipping up her suitcase and headed downstairs. The trip to the airport was quiet. Cesca mulled over the conversation she had had with her mother about allowing love into her life once more. She wasn't sure if she loved him yet, but she liked Zadok. She liked him a lot. The few kisses they had shared so far were sweet, and they had made her heart flutter each time. The thought made her shift in her seat and smile to herself softly. But again, she had to be cautious. You can't allow one bad experience to color how you see everything. Give him a chance. Give him a chance? That's what her mother said she should do. But what if she gave him a chance, and she was hurt all over again? Zadok fidgeted with his keys. He was in love with Cesca. It hadn't hit him until she left for Brookville, but he was, without a doubt in his mind, in love with her. He had not been able to stop thinking about Cesca, his Cesca, over Thanksgiving. He missed the pleasant, fruity smell he inhaled each time he hugged her. He missed the smile that made the cells in his heart do cartwheels in excitement, and those curves in all the right places and her milk chocolate skin. Perfection. Zadok missed everything about Cesca. His heart thrummed with excitement at the thought of seeing her again after 3 long days. He glanced at the arrivals display at the Philadelphia International Airport. Cesca's plane had landed. He couldn't wait to see her. When Zadok finally spotted Cesca, a thrill ran up and down his spine. Yes, he definitely had never felt this way about anyone before. Chapter 13. On her part, Cesca's heart quickened at the sight of him. She had come to Philly expecting to heal from trauma, and here she was, falling in love. Didn't it take years for people to fall in love? Cesca's head tried to tell her heart it was hormones. Her heart was a different story, however. Zadok's arms were already extended by the time she reached him, and she walked right into the circle of his arms and allowed herself to be engulfed by him. "I missed you, sweetheart," Zadok said first. His lips brushed her cheek and then traveled to her mouth for a brief and yet sweet moment. Cesca noticed a blush through the paler skin of his cheeks after the encounter. Heady joy filled her knowing she'd caused that. On the ride back to her apartment, they chatted easily and filled each other in on what happened at Thanksgiving on both ends. Once they got to her apartment, Zadok offered to bring Cesca's suitcase inside. The brisk late November cold was hitting Philly hard, so Cesca offered to make him a cup of tea. Truth be told, she also wanted him to hang around for a while. She left him in her living room to set a teapot on the stove. She walked back into the living room to find him comfortably reclining on the couch, watching something mindless on the large TV that hung from across the couch. Cesca claimed the cushy matching armchair in another corner of the room. Their eyes met and held for several moments. "Why are you sitting way over there?" Zadok spoke, his voice calm and low. Cesca felt a quick rush of warmth travel from her chest and into her belly. "I like the view from here," she responded, shrugging her shoulders and smiling shyly. Before she knew it, he was standing in front of her. Taking her hands, he helped her slowly up from her seat. His gaze never left her, and he didn't let go when she stood up. Their gazes held for a few seconds. Her breath hitched before he started speaking again. Drawing her close to him, he hugged her again and planted a kiss on her forehead. He leaned his forehead against hers as he whispered, "I've never felt the way I feel about anyone before. I'm in love with you, and I want to know how you feel about that." She stared at him with wide eyes and was staring at him with a blank look. "Cesca, did you hear me?" He rubbed his hands on her arms. "I heard you," she said, her voice low and almost a whisper. She wiggled herself out of his arms and took a step back. A hurt look crossed his face, but he remained silent and stared at her through those brown eyes she'd come to adore. Her thoughts jumbled. She turned away from him as she spoke. "Zadok, you're wonderful. When I moved to Philly, I was running away from my failed relationship, and then I met you." She paused and swallowed. The painful lump in her throat seemed to be getting heavier by the minute. She turned to look at him. Zadok was still silent. The smile that was there earlier was now gone, and his eyes were boring into hers. She continued to speak. "Zadok, you're wonderful." "Yes, Cesca. You said that already.
What I'm wondering is why you're telling me I'm wonderful in that tone.
Zadok passed his hand over his face, his voice now impatient. Worry lines crinkled his handsome face. This was harder than she realized. After the conversation with her mother over Thanksgiving, it had seemed straightforward. Give love a chance. But she was Cesca. She was an overthinker. One heartbreak was enough. What if Zadok got up one day and decided she wasn't good enough for a successful and handsome surgeon like him? She wanted to give it a shot, but what if it failed? She wasn't sure where the hesitancy was coming from, but here it was. Zadok, I think we should take things slow.
Why?
Cesca finally moved from where she had been transfixed for the last few minutes. She wrapped her arms around her middle and hugged herself tightly. The heat was on in her apartment, yet it was as if someone had poured a bucket of icy water over her. I don't know. I just don't feel I'm ready for this right now, she sighed and paced the floor a couple of times. Listen, as far back as I can remember, I was in a committed relationship. My ex and I had been together since we were teenagers. She paused for him to say something. Anything. He only stared back at her with a look that was a mix between anger and shock. Great, she continued, the exasperation in her voice building. I've never had a chance to find myself, to know who I really am outside of a relationship. This thing between you and me, I think it's happening too fast, and I'm afraid I'll make the same mistakes and never have the chance to find who I am outside of all of this. Partially true, but this was all she was willing to say under the circumstances.
Is that it?
Zadok finally asked. No, it wasn't. This was not the only reason she was asking them to take things slow. The main reason had to do with the fact that, in her eyes, they were mismatched. Zadok was gorgeous and needed to have a Miss America type on his arm. She was not bad looking, but she was no stunning beauty. Wide hips, a butt that jiggled a little too much, a stomach that had never familiarized itself with the concept of a six-pack, and hair that curled and matted in the rain. He was gorgeous. She was plain. But for all the tense atmosphere she'd created this evening, she was not about to admit that to Zadok. Instead, she lied. Yes. She shifted her feet, her gaze falling to the ground. Yes, that is all. Zadok's pained gaze was now fixed on a space in the distance. He turned around, picked up his coat, and began slipping it on. Now it was Cesca's turn to be concerned at his silence. Aren't you going to say something? He was buttoning up the wool coat now.
What do you want me to say, Cesca?
His gaze lifted from the button he had been fidgeting with to meet hers. He spoke in a calm yet cold tone Cesca had never heard him use.
You said you wanted us to take things slow. You said you wanted to find yourself.
He took 2 steps towards her, but did not touch her.
So, that is exactly what I'm going to do. I will give you the space you need to find yourself. I'll stay away until you decide I'm worthy of your love.
Worthy? Of course he was worthy of her love. She was the one who wasn't worthy of him. Cesca's mind went to an article she had read in grad school about past trauma and self-sabotaging behaviors. Was this what she was doing to herself? Zadok,
let me finish.
He cut in before she could go any further.
Cesca, I love you. I don't play games. Even as a boy, I knew I never wanted to lead a woman on if I didn't love her. And I haven't. It feels really good to be able to tell you I love you. I've never said it to anyone because I'd never come across anyone who lit me up like you do. He paused and straightened his back. But I respect your boundaries. So if you think I'm moving too fast and you need to find yourself, please, go ahead. When you make up your mind about who you are and what role I play in your life, you let me know. He began to move towards the door. Cesca was still standing in the same spot. A sob escaped her throat. 3 paces from the door, Zadok came to an abrupt halt. His back was to her. It's not like I have a line of women waiting for me to date.
His voice had now taken on a disappointed tone.
but I am looking for someone to share the rest of my life with. I can't see myself doing that with anyone else but you. I'm sorry Brian did what he did to you. I'm sorry he's made it hard for you to trust anyone. You might have no reason to trust me, but I promise that if you ever decide to give me a chance, I'll never let you down."
Without looking back, he walked out the door, but not before he muttered sadly,
"Good night, Cesca."
Zadok slammed the door to his convertible. Grabbing the steering wheel, he looked straight ahead. What just happened? It had been so nice to pick Cesca up from the airport. It had been a pleasant drive to her place. They had conversed freely, and the air had held no hint of tension at all. And he hadn't felt he was rushing her, but she had just told him he had been. His chest felt heavy. The initial shock of her words was wearing off, but the sharp pain lingered in his chest.
"Lord, I don't understand, but you know what's best. I leave this in your hands."
After he'd left, Cesca sank deep into her armchair. She had been hungry before they entered the apartment. The hunger was forgotten now. She liked Zadok, really liked him. He was handsome, charming, sweet, and godly. His aftershave smelled like something she would inhale just to receive comfort on a stormy day. His smile, bright enough to light any room. So why was she scared? Why had she blurted out that they were moving too fast? She wanted to give him a chance, but a fat tear rolled down her face. She had been devastated when she found out another woman was pregnant with Brian's baby. It had been as if that woman had ripped her heart right out of her chest. Now, almost a year later, that pain was back. Only this time, she was the one who had caused it. Chapter 14. She thought the pain would diminish by the time she woke up the following day, but it hadn't. The sense of loss lanced through her like a scalpel. After she was convinced she could leak no more tears last night, Cesca managed to change and fall asleep in her bed. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it was restless and full of bad dreams. In one dream, she was sitting in a boat with Zadok on what looked like a calm lake. All of a sudden, an angry gale tore through the calmness and separated the boat into two, Zadok on one half and she on the other. She kept on crying out for him to come back, but the wind blew them away until she couldn't see him anymore. Waking up with a start, sweat on her brow, Cesca found the late November sun peering through the blinds in her bedroom. The clock read 7 a.m. Time to go back to work and face reality. She prayed a short prayer for strength and wisdom. She was going to need that in bucket loads for a while. 3 weeks had passed since Zadok and Cesca had argued. He had not called or texted her. He had stopped coming by her office. The only time she had seen him in the last 3 weeks was in a meeting where a mutual patient's care plan was being discussed. Their eyes had met briefly during the meeting. He'd smiled at her when their eyes met, but shot Tori's gaze away quickly to concentrate on the meeting. His smile had made her insides go warm that day. She missed him. Oh, she missed him. The way he looked at her, the smell of his spicy aftershave, the genuine care she noted in his eyes each minute they had spent together over the last few months. As lunchtime drew close today, Cesca noted how much she missed the simple act of having lunch with Zadok. To break the boredom of staring at the four walls of her office and eating alone for the umpteenth time in 3 weeks, she decided to go to the cafeteria to have her lunch today. At least the noise in the cafeteria would provide some comfort. "You going to lunch, Miss Ampah?" Donna asked enthusiastically as Cesca locked her door and stepped into the clinic hallway at lunchtime. Cesca smiled and nodded. "Do you mind if I join you?" Cesca didn't. So they left for the cafeteria together. Although she was old enough to be her mother, Donna chatted freely, and Cesca felt like this woman was really a new friend. She had been an ally since day one of her employment. She hadn't had many friends growing up, so this was nice. The thought brought a smile to Cesca's face as they took the elevator down to eat. At least some parts of my life are going well. "Hey, isn't that—" Donna had begun to say as they entered the large cafeteria where at least 100 people were having their lunches. Cesca's eyes followed the direction of Donna's. Ms. Ampah, the food is this way. Donna seemed to try to change the topic, but Cesca didn't hear her. Right smack in the middle of the cafeteria was Zadok. A woman who looked to be in her mid-20s sat across the table from him. Dark, luscious hair, pretty, slender. Her smile was gorgeous. She's his type, Cesca mused. Her heart lurched painfully. As if sensing her presence, Zadok lifted his eyes from across the room to look at her. He cast a sad smile her way and looked like he was about to wave. But then he dropped his hand and allowed his eyes to drift back to his companion. Cesca looked away and sighed. Donna was quiet while they got their food. Once they sat at the table, Cesca tried to be cheery, but Donna had seen right through it. Look, Donna started, I don't know what happened between you and Dr. Cho, but whatever it is, one of you has to fix it. Cesca's gaze remained on her lunch tray. I'm not his type, Donna. What are you talking about? Donna, I'm not his type. I'm plain. He's gorgeous and successful. I'm just not the type of woman he should be with. When Donna didn't respond to her statement, Cesca looked up and into the older woman's incredulous face. Donna chuckled before she spoke. You're kidding me, right? That man looks at you in a way I've never seen him look at a woman in the half-decade I've worked with him. Cesca, trust me when I say this. That boy only has eyes for you. Sitting here blabbering about not being his type. Shoot. Donna continued, a laugh in her voice. Baby, if a man had looked at me like that when I was your age, I would have snapped him up so quick and had all his babies. He wouldn't know what hit him. A hearty chuckle rippled through the older woman as she narrowed her eyes to look at Cesca. Cesca couldn't help but laugh with her friend. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. You really think he has eyes for me? She asked, not necessarily directing the question at Donna. Donna finished the juice she was drinking and set the cup back on her tray before she responded. If I didn't know better... Wait, I do know better. Donna laughed at her own joke and then said, Dr. Cho is head over heels in love with you. She was in love with him too. Now what was she going to do about it? Honey, you're sure you want to spend Christmas by yourself? It was 3 days from Christmas, and Cecilia was on the phone trying to convince her daughter to come back home for Christmas. Yep, Mom, I'll be fine. No, she wouldn't. She knew going home might help her feel less lonely now that Zadok had managed to stay out of her way for almost a month. She had told him she wanted to find herself. Doing that was proving a miserable task. The day before, she'd bought a Christmas tree, her first one. Thankfully, she'd gotten someone from the TaskRabbit app to come into her house to set it up nicely for her. All she needed to do was decorate the tree now. A gift from her mother sat next to the tree. Jemima's present was in the mail. Tears threatened to attack her, but she held them back. Mom, it will be okay. I just need to do this for myself. God willing, next year we can have the big family thing. Okay, honey, if you insist. I love you, baby. Her voice almost broke as she managed an, I love you, Mom, before she hung up. It wasn't like she was going to be completely alone. Jemima had put plans in place to ensure the whole family would be on a video conference call, at least for the gift opening on Christmas Day. Placing her phone on the armchair, she went back to decorating the Christmas tree. Although the clinic wasn't fully closed, Cesca had the 3 days leading up to Christmas off, and then she would get back to work on December 27th. She was still on call if an emergency arose, but that didn't seem likely. Almost an hour after she had hung up the phone with her mother, Cesca was done decorating the tree. It wasn't lost on her that future Christmases could involve a husband and child helping her decorate the tree. A husband. A child. Those seemed so far-fetched at the moment, but she couldn't help but think of the beauty of such a moment in the future. A smile spread on her face. Standing back to look at her tree, she crossed her hands across her chest. A sense of pride and another emotion she could not place washed over her. It's time for Christmas music. She gathered the boxes the ornaments had come in and stacked them near the trash can in her kitchen. It would go in the recycling can come trash day. She grabbed her phone and navigated to a music app. The app already provided several pre-made playlists filled with all types of Christmas music. Scrolling through to a playlist she liked, she looked for her favorite Christmas carol, "O Holy Night," was by far Cesca's favorite Christmas carol. Without much fuss, she found it and hit the play button. As the rich strains of the old hymn began to fill the Bluetooth speakers she purchased for this very reason, her phone buzzed. Picking it up, the name of the sender made her heart race and her ears grow warm. Zadok.
Can I call you?
Cesca stared at her phone for several minutes. Of course you can call me. I've been dying to hear from you. Typing bubbles appeared at the bottom of the text when she hadn't responded in a few minutes. Zadok.
Is it a bad time?
She was shaking now. Steadying herself, she sent a response. Cesca. No, you can call me. His call came through almost immediately.
Hey, he started. How are you?
He sounded breathless. Oh, I've been better, she mused. The thought did not reach her lips, however. I'm doing well. What's up? Maybe he was calling about a patient. Yeah, right. Has he ever called you about a patient?
Donna told me you were going to be in town for Christmas.
He paused over the phone as if he expected her to say something. When she hadn't said anything after a few seconds, he continued.
The choir at our church puts on a yearly carols night. It's tomorrow night. If you're not doing anything, I'd like to invite you.
Then, as if he needed to clarify his intentions for the invitation, he added,
My mother is in the choir, and she'd be happy to see you there.
Cesca wondered if Zadok would be happy to see her there. Sure, I'd love to come. When is it?
Service starts at 7. There will be a prayer, a short sermon, and then the rest will be the singing, he responded.
Sounds good. I'll see you then.
See you, Cesca.
The phone went silent after that. Cesca held on to the phone for several minutes after the call. Her emotions were in a tailspin. Zadok had sounded cordial enough tonight. But what about the confession he made the night he walked out of her apartment? Hearing them speak today, one would never guess they'd had such a conversation. And now, after almost 4 weeks of silence, he'd called to invite her to a carol service. What would she say when she saw him? What would she do with all the emotions she'd been feeling all these weeks? Cesca laid the phone in her lap and wrapped the quilt her mother had bought her one Christmas when she was a teenager around her. Christmas music continued to swirl around her. Jemima. She had to call her. She always knew what to say. Thank God for chatty cousins. She dialed Jemima's number. On the third ring, Jemima picked up and replaced any type of salutation with, Girl, did you change your mind about coming home for Christmas? No, I'm staying in Philly, but something has come up. What? Jemima sounded alarmed. Cesca chuckled. Zadok just called and invited me to Carol's service at his church tomorrow. The other end of the line was quiet for a bit, and then Jemima spoke up again. So what did you say to him? I told him I'd come. So what in the world are you calling me for, Cesca? Go meet this man and put him out of his misery. Cesca held the phone closer to her ear as if anything else would threaten her ability to hear Jemima. You really think he's been miserable because of me? Oh, Cesca, honey, I don't know. But from everything you've told me about him, he seems sweet and considerate, even after you told him you needed space to find yourself. Pausing, Jemima let out a loud, audible sigh. She continued speaking, her voice taking on a compassionate tone. Honey, listen. So many people are walking around looking for miracles to happen to them. But miracles also require you to take a step of faith. People forget that sometimes. In the Word, remember the woman who had been bleeding for years? She was healed in the end. But what did she do first? She left her house, made the decision to touch Jesus' garment, and that action of touching Jesus led to healing. You understand what I'm saying? Silent tears were coursing down Cesca's face at this point. Yes, I do. Oh, Cesca, honey, don't cry. I get it. You've been through a lot, and you don't want to get hurt again. But maybe God sent Zadok your way because he wanted to show you something better than what you thought you had with Brian. Take a step of faith and let that miracle happen. Life is hard, but we have to keep moving. We can't let one event keep us bound. But he didn't say anything about getting back together. Well, technically, they did not have a real relationship before this either. Whatever they had, she'd broken it. Cesca, that man loves you. Trust me. A man doesn't just invite a casual friend to visit with his family, take them on fancy dates, and tell them I love you. Go get your man. Cesca laughed out loud through tears at her cousin's last sentence. Sniffling and wiping a tear, she responded, Thanks, Jay. I think God knew I needed a strong person to talk sense into my life, so he made us cousins. I know that's right, Jemima responded with a light laugh. Cesca allowed waves of relief and laughter to wash over her, too. Before the call ended, she asked, Hey, Jay, do you have a recipe for those Christmas cookies Nana Potts used to make us when we were kids? Chapter 15. Zadok knotted his tie as he stood in front of the mirror. A red one, to contrast with the crisp white shirt and dark suit he was wearing for service. It was Christmas time, after all. A red tie seemed appropriate. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about his brief chat with Cesca the day before. He couldn't tell from her voice if she was happy to hear from him or not. He'd wanted to bring up their disagreement from weeks ago, but the call had been too brief. Maybe bringing it up would feel like he was rushing her again? That's just an excuse. You could have brought it up. You were afraid of being rejected. He was sure he'd fallen all the way in love with her, but he was in no mood to be rejected once again. He couldn't compete against her past experiences. Cesca wasn't the type of person he was content to be friends with. He wanted more. And if he was being honest, being a friend would hurt more than staying away like he had the last few weeks. His phone rang. The caller ID indicated it was his mother. Hi, Mom. Zadok, Dad and I are on our way to the church now. Is Cesca coming? Her voice sounded slightly hollow, so Zadok figured they were driving. She said she'd come, he answered simply. That's good, Zadok. Did you also tell her to come to the house after the service? He hadn't asked her that. No, I didn't. I wanted to see how she was feeling after the service before I asked. Okay, honey. Well, we'll see you there. I see your sister's car here already. His parents were already at the church. It was time he hung up and left, too. See you there, Mom. After he hung up, he thought about texting Cesca. Walking from the bathroom where he'd been dressing up into his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his phone and again tapped on her name and began typing. Zadok. Hey, I look forward to seeing you at the service tonight. Her response came back quickly. Cesca. I'm already here. See you soon. She'd added a smiling emoji. He smiled. Maybe this was the season for him to receive his miracle? Half an hour later, he was at the Cornerstone Church. He'd looked forward to the carol's night service each year. There had been a few years in residency when he hadn't been able to make it due to an emergency. But if he could help it, he decided to never miss these services the Cornerstone held each year. This year's service was different, though. Cesca was here. Ever since he had seen her at the cafeteria and their eyes had held, he knew what he felt for her was more than a fleeting fancy. Although he had torn his gaze away that day to continue eating with his lunch companion, he had allowed himself furtive glances as she'd moved around the cafeteria. It had taken everything in him not to walk up to where she and Donna had been eating and ask to talk to Cesca privately. After that, the urge to contact her had grown more and more intense with each passing moment until he'd succumbed and tried to find her at her office. Upon his arrival, he'd found out she was on vacation until December 27th. He couldn't wait that long. So he texted and called her, and now she was here. With him. Well, not technically, but at least she was here. He willed himself to stop staring through the windshield of his parked SUV like a fool and enter the church. The church sanctuary held around 100 people. Cesca noted that many of the adults there seemed to be around her age, and several appeared to be married with children. A baby nearby let out a happy cry. A little boy 2 rows ahead of her was already dozing off on his mother's arm. A 16-foot Christmas tree was beautifully adorned and sat on the church stage. Soft piano music with the gentle strains of an electric guitar reached her ears. Everything seemed so homely and warm, and for a few minutes, Cesca forgot about the homesickness she'd been experiencing this week.
Zadok, where are you sitting?
Her cell phone pinged at Zadok's text message. Cesca looked around in an attempt to take in where she was sitting. She shot him back a description and was by her side in less than 2 minutes.
Hi,
he said simply, flashing his brilliant smile her way. She had missed that smile. Hi, Zadok, she responded. He must have not realized what he was doing, because he grabbed a hold of her hand and whispered,
You look great.
A simple action, yet it had lit all her nerve endings on fire. Her ears were burning with a fury as she felt tingles and warmth all over. She didn't try to let go of his hands and felt abandoned when he pulled them away. She had debated long and hard about what to wear to the service. In the end, she had settled on a red knitted dress that reached her knees, a black blazer, and woolen tights to protect her legs from the cold. On her feet, she wore a pair of heeled booties. Her hair was in braids, which she had gathered into a bun above her head. She finished the look with delicate gold earrings and a simple gold necklace. It felt good to know that Zadok noticed she'd put effort into her look tonight. She wished she could just tell him, I wanted to look good for you. Thank you, she responded instead. You don't look bad yourself.
What? I look fantastic.
He smiled and winked at her, and she couldn't help but smile till her cheeks hurt. Did God approve of this type of flirting in church? She wasn't sure, but since he'd put Adam and Eve in the garden, he must have known something like this was bound to happen between his creation. Zadok was glad he'd invited Cesca, and that she was sitting beside him, and she looked gorgeous, and that the pleasant fruity scent he had associated with Cesca wafted to his nostrils every few seconds. It felt glorious. The carol service was as wonderful as ever. The choir belted out old and new Christmas tunes that reminded him of the love of God and how that love led the Father to send his Son to a world that sometimes didn't even realize or acknowledge his love. And yet still, there was love, divine love for anyone who wanted to come in spite of what their past looked like, what the color of their skin was, or what language they spoke. All they needed to experience that unconditional love was to accept that Jesus loved them. Zadok knew this, but today the thought overwhelmed him as he listened to the music and the sermon. Before they both knew it, the service was over and people were leaving the church.
Hey, my parents always liked to have Christmas Eve chocolate before Christmas Day.
None of his siblings could make it this year. They were all spending Christmas with their in-laws since Thanksgiving had been at the Cho's.
You want to come have chocolate with us?
Cesca looked unsure at first, but then a smile curved her beautiful lips. Lips Zadok hadn't quite been able to stop thinking about this evening.
For the last month, even.
Sure, I'll come. Their address? Even though she had been with him to his parents for the baby shower, it occurred to Zadok that she had only been there twice. He recited it as she typed it into her phone. Afterward, she lifted her gaze to him. Actually, I made something for you, she said happily once she had typed into the address on her phone. Just then, Mr. and Mrs. Cho walked up to them, each of them greeting Cesca with a hug. You're coming to the house with us, Cesca? Daniel Cho spoke. When she responded in the affirmative, smiles spread across the older couple's faces. A few minutes later, they left with the promise to see them shortly.
So you had something for me?
Zadok asked expectantly. Yes, come with me. Why are you nervous? You baked a man some cookies. You're not proposing marriage to him. They're just cookies. Well, they really weren't just any cookies. Any cookies were the cookies you bought at Walmart or Target or some oversized grocery chain. No, this was her grandma's special chocolate cookie recipe that she had only made at Christmas for the people she loved, and she had spent the day perfecting them for Zadok. No, she was not proposing marriage, but like her cousin had told her the day before, she was taking a step of faith and hoping these would communicate an ounce of what she felt for the sweet caramel giant who'd captured her heart despite her imperfections. Most of the families, including Zadok's, had already left the parking lot. Zadok was only a few paces behind her as she opened the passenger side of her car and retrieved a traditional festive round red, green, and white cookie tin that she had placed the special cookies in. I made you these cookies.
You made me these cookies,
Zadok repeated. Gratitude marked his features. In the well-lit parking lot, Cesca noticed, perhaps more intently than she had noticed before, how much adoration Zadok held in his eyes for her. Taking the can of cookies from her hands, he placed it on top of her car. He took 2 steps towards her and opened his arms. She walked straight into them, and he brought them close into an embrace. She needed him. His love, his strength, his kindness. He was a balm to her heart, and she needed every part of him. Cesca closed her eyes and allowed herself to melt into Zadok's arms. Neither of them spoke for a long while. After what seemed like a really long time of simply holding each other in a church parking lot of all places, Zadok reluctantly tore himself from the embrace, but still held both of her hands.
Cesca, we need to talk.
Yeah, we do, she responded at the end of a loud sigh.
Okay, let's do this. Take a ride with me. Your car is going to be safe here. Pastor Samuel doesn't mind if someone parks in the lot overnight. We can stop by my place and chat before we go to my parents' place. I'll just tell them we had to stop at my place. How does that sound?
She nodded as he grabbed the cookie tin and led her with his other hand to his car. He was still in heaven, and right now he felt like he was walking on a special cloud. Chapter 16. Cesca had been to Zadok's home a handful of times, but tonight there was a specialness about it all. It was a simple 2-story townhome in a quiet suburb, something Cesca would have guessed a family with 2 children would call home. Once they were safely indoors, he helped her take her coat off. He took off his tie, muttering something about restrictive ties. He proceeded to unbutton the first 2 buttons on his shirt. Again, she was taken by how gorgeous he was. She allowed a breathy sigh to escape her lips. He turned and smiled broadly at her, motioning for them to sit. We'll have chocolate and tea at my parents'. I know they will wait for us, so let's talk. Cesca swallowed and nodded. Her pulse was racing faster than a quarter horse. She was sitting on his couch while he pulled one of his dining chairs and was straddling it. Their eyes met. I missed you, Cesca. She looked at his warm brown eyes. There was no guile in them. I missed you too. She lowered her gaze briefly. So why didn't you call me? I don't know. I felt foolish. I had asked you to take things slow right after you said you loved me. I felt... Her voice trembled. I don't know what I felt. Maybe I felt too embarrassed or too proud. I don't know. He laughed his musical laugh. I spoke to Donna. I went looking for you a few days ago, and she told me you were on vacation. It's Christmas, Cesca. Were you really trying to spend it alone? Yes, came her wobbly-voiced response. He had a point. Anyone who could help it really needed to be spending Christmas around people they love. But this was one year where Cesca felt staying out of the festivities and enjoying some solitude might be healing for her. Besides, it's not like I'll be alone. We'll video conference parts of it. Convincing herself was proving to be more difficult than she'd anticipated. Zadok must have read the confusion on her face. Zadok smiled at her knowingly. Somehow, I don't believe that. Silence stretched between them. The smile went away from his face. A wintry wind blew outside. He leaned closer to her. Cesca, what's the real reason you asked me to stay away? Well, actually, I had asked you if we could take it slow. You are the one who interpreted it as a message to stay away. She was right. He had interpreted her message that day to the extreme, and he regretted it deeply. He moved from the dining chair onto the couch with her. I know. I'm sorry. I need to work on my comprehension skills. He reached out to hold her hands. She gave him her hands and looked at him tenderly. Her smile faded, but there was still warmth in her eyes. Yes, you do, Zadok. I was so mad at you for ignoring me the way you did. His chest reverberated with laughter. He stood up, walked to stand in front of her, and lifted her to stand with him. She paused and allowed her hands to rest on his broad chest, allowing herself to get lost in his eyes. She could feel his heart beating furiously under her in her palms, and was convinced she felt him shudder at her touch. It felt good to touch him.
"I'm sorry, sweetheart."
"I'm sorry, too." He took her hand and kissed the inside of her palm. He brought her hand down from his lips, but didn't let them go.
"So tell me, why did you want to take things slow?"
"Who was the pretty dark-haired woman you were with the day I saw you at the cafeteria?" Cesca blurted out before she knew what she was saying. "What has this got to do with anything?" Cesca chided herself for the question. It probably was none of her business, but she had been curious. Zadok looked confused at first, but then a sly smirk that traveled to his eyes grew on his face.
"Were you jealous?"
"A little," Cesca responded, letting a smile frame her own features. There was no need to pretend at this point. A soft laugh rippled through his body and grew into a full-on belly laugh. Once he calmed from laughing so hard, he responded,
"Cesca Ampah? Jealous of someone? I never would have guessed," he continued. "But since you want to know, she is a first-year surgical resident. She noticed I was eating by myself and sat with me for lunch."
Sheesh, how embarrassing. When she spoke again, it was slow and calculated. "I thought she was your type." He looked puzzled again.
"Excuse me? My type?"
If there was ever a time to come clean about the real reason she had asked to slow things down, something that seemed incredibly stupid now that she thought about it, it was now. "Yeah, your type." She swallowed hard and eased herself out of his hands. She had only admitted this to her mother and cousin. It was new territory. But sometimes new, although terrifying, could be good. "Zadok, I've struggled with self-esteem all my life. I was always the chubby one, and nobody has ever described me as pretty." She made air quotes as she spoke. "When my ex-fiance started paying attention to me in high school, I thought it was a fluke. I kept expecting to wake up one day and have him tell me that he had found someone else prettier than me to love." She swallowed the painful lump that was beginning to form in her throat. Turning to face a window in Zadok's house, she continued, "Although it took him more than a decade, he did in fact choose to love and marry someone else."
"And you thought I would do the same to you,"
Zadok offered, his voice low and sad. Cesca turned to face him again and nodded, folding her arms across her chest. "Yes." She unfolded her arms, looked at her hands, and continued, "Zadok, you look like you should be in a Hollywood movie or something. But then you asked me out. Me. Plain old me with a gorgeous man. It just didn't add up in my mind. And then, just as I was warming up to the idea that maybe you really liked me for who I was, you told me you loved me. It was scary for me, and I freaked out." When she looked back at him, all she saw was tenderness. He reached out for her and slowly wrapped his arms around her, easing her from the hug but not letting her go. His hands traveled to her face and cupped the sides of it.
"You have no idea what you do to me, do you, Cesca Ampah? Let me show you."
He lowered his head, captured her mouth with his, and kissed her. Cesca lifted her arms so they met at his neck and kissed him back. The slow and intentional kiss lit her nerves on fire and left both of them breathless. After the kiss, he nuzzled her neck before he spoke again.
"So you thought I'd stop loving you because you consider yourself plain?"
When he said it like that, it sounded vain on her part, but yeah, that was exactly it. "Yeah. It just seemed you could have been with someone more slender, less curvy, less plain-looking." Tears began to fall down her face again as she balled one hand into a fist at her side. He held her at arm's length and looked at her. "Let's get a few things clear." He looked serious now. "First of all, I am not your ex. I am Zadok Cho, not Brian. She lifted her teary eyes to meet his gaze as he continued. Second, I've never been into these Miss America types you reference. I'm into you. You're the most beautiful woman to me, and I love you just the way you are. At first, I didn't think it was possible. I didn't think it was possible because I've loved you since the day I met you in the hallway eating Donna's jam-filled croissant. I love everything about you. Everything? Everything. His voice was low and encouraging. What do you love about me? She wiggled her eyebrows in a way that made him laugh. Your round hips drive me crazy each time you sway them. Each time I think of you, I can't help but think that God perfectly molded each curve specifically for me, he continued. Everything about you is perfect to me. I'm really sorry that Brian hurt you, and I'm really sorry that people were ever mean to you or overlooked you because of how you look. But I am not those people. And trust me when I say this. Everything about you is perfect to me. And if you were my wife, every night I would make sure to kiss every single curve till you begged me to stop, just to remind you of how crazy I am about you. The passion and sincerity with which he'd said everything made Cesca straighten her back as goosebumps spread all over her body. All she could do in response was stare at him with rounded eyes. She believed him. Jemima's words to her the afternoon before came rushing back to her. You have to take your step of faith towards your miracle. Zadok was her miracle. His eyes spelled love, a love she hadn't yet encountered in any man in her life. This was her miracle, and if she didn't take a step of faith, she could destroy it forever. Cesca, are you still with me? Zadok squeezed her hands, his eyes full of love and pleading. I'm here, she said. Are you going to say anything to what I just said? You said if I was your wife, you would... I would kiss every curve, every night, till you begged me to stop, just to show you how much I will never stop loving everything about you, he finished for her. Cesca had not closed her mouth or stopped staring at him since he'd uttered the word wife a few seconds ago. You want to marry me? You have a problem with that? He brought her into a close embrace and looked into her eyes. Me? A problem? With Mr. Gorgeous Surgeon? No! She was suddenly tongue-tied. Cesca? Hello? Are you still listening to me? He waved his left hand in front of her face. Came her response. Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if you were still paying attention to me or if I had shocked you to oblivion. She smiled at him fully now. No, you didn't shock me. I just didn't expect you to say something like that on Christmas Eve. He took both of her hands in his and kissed them lightly. Electricity arced between them. Cesca, I've never wanted to play games with a woman's heart. He'd seen his sister's heart broken a time or two and never wanted to do that to someone else's daughter or sister. I've always prayed and asked that God would help me find someone who wanted to be a wife and not just a girlfriend. I want to court you and go on more romantic dates with you. And then I want to marry you so I can kiss you whenever I want and go on more romantic dates with you till we're old and gray. I love you. And what I don't know is if you feel the same way about me. His warm brown eyes were searching her dark ones for several quiet minutes. Zadok had unlocked parts of her heart she'd never thought she would open up after Brian. He doesn't want to play games with a woman's heart? How many men even speak like that anymore? Well, obviously the one that stood in front of her did. She loved him. It was time he knew that. She reached up and touched his clean-shaven face and touched her lips to his for the briefest moment. His eyes drifted shut at the action. Yes, Zadok, I want to be courted, and I want to be your wife. I think I'd be the luckiest woman on earth to be your wife. As the bold words rolled off her tongue, Zadok brought her closer to his body.
All this talk of marriage makes me want to kiss you more. How about we stop talking and explore that thought some more?
She giggled and drew closer to him, for in that moment she wanted nothing more in the world than to be kissed by her sweet caramel giant. 1 year and 6 days after Zadok Cho had come upon Cesca Ampah eating a strawberry jam-filled croissant in the hospital hallway at the Philadelphia University Hospital, they were getting married. The morning of the wedding had been zany. Cesca had already had one tearful moment when she found out part of her family flying in the night before had been delayed. All was settled now, but it had been a cause for panic. Apart from that, Cesca had been able to deal with the rest of the craziness. The night Zadok had told her his intentions and she had reciprocated them, they shared many sweet kisses. They proceeded to his parents' house shortly after that and informed them. Left to his devices, Zadok would have swept her in his arms and marched down to the pastor's house and asked him to bless the marriage that night. Zadok never does anything halfway, Cesca mused and smiled as she thought of her groom. Thankfully, his parents had talked him out of his excitement. Then it had been 9 more exciting months of dating, lingering kisses, planning, and spending every bit of the time they could get off together. All that had culminated in today. And Cesca couldn't be happier. As the wedding march started and Cesca stared straight at Zadok, she could tell he was deeply in love with her. "Thank you, Lord, for ordering my steps," came her silent prayer. This was it. He hadn't bailed on her. She was getting married to her miracle. Epilogue. 18 months later. Cesca's eyes opened to golden sun rays pouring through the slits of ceiling-high curtains that cascaded to the ground. The house was silent except for the sound of birds chirping outside, which meant Zadok had already left for work. She had the day off, so sleeping in was her prerogative today. The digital bedside clock read 6:31. She reached out to touch his side of the bed and brought the comforter close to her body to hug it. She could hardly believe that she was married to him. She had never felt so loved, so safe. Zadok had not let up on his promise to kiss her curves each night. The thought sent heat waves through her body even now. She rolled over onto her belly to catch the last vestiges of sleep. A dull pain in her breast caught her attention. That is new. She closed her eyes and ignored it for a few moments. A minute later, she shot up from the bed and ran to the bathroom that was built into the master bedroom. She looked into the large mirror that took up most of the bathroom wall and examined herself. Her breasts were slightly swollen, and they were in fact tender to the touch. Running her hands over her sides, she tried hard to remember the last time she had seen her period. She wasn't one of those women who meticulously kept tabs on their periods, but it occurred to her that she had not seen it for at least a month. Maybe 2. Grabbing a pair of jeans and the nearest t-shirt, she got ready in 5 minutes and raced her car down to the Rite Aid pharmacy that was a mere mile from them. Rushing back home, the test confirmed what she had suspected since she had rolled over that morning. She was pregnant. Health professional that she wasn't satisfied until she had gone to the urgent care clinic at the same Rite Aid pharmacy to confirm it. When Zadok walked through the door around 7 that evening, she accosted him with more than a few kisses on his face and neck. "Maybe I should leave you at home like this every day if this is the welcome I will be getting," he said through breathless laughter. She was pulling him to the large brown and gold couch in the foyer that was just off to the left once you entered their home. Again, she kissed him amidst laughter from both of them. Zadok pulled back reluctantly and looked at his wife intensely. His voice was understandably husky. "Babe, okay, I love a good get attacked with kisses from your wife, but you'll have to tell me what's going on." "We're having a little Cho," she said, rubbing her hands over her middle. Zadok looked at her incredulously. His eyes grew larger than she'd ever seen them. "You're pregnant?" She nodded wildly, unable to contain the joy she'd been bottling all day. He suddenly got up. "Zadok, what are you—" Cesca didn't get to finish what she was saying. He lifted her from the couch and headed toward the staircase. Putting her hands around his neck, she smiled sweetly up at him. And where exactly are you taking me, Dr. Cho? He grinned.
You know exactly where.
So a celebration, then?
Yes, a celebration.
I love celebrations, she said through uncontrollable giggles. His lovemaking was always unselfish and thorough. Afterwards, she lay on his bare chest, bathed in satisfaction and joy she didn't think was possible less than 3 years ago. He was stroking her arms and kissing the top of her head.
Thanks for marrying me, Cesca. And for this baby.
She was making lazy circles on his chest. A few tears were now threatening to come down her cheeks. I didn't make the baby myself, you know. I had help from this really handsome guy. He took in a deep breath and laughed.
Yes, you did.
We're going to be happy, Zadok, aren't we?
Yes, we are, Cesca.
He kissed the top of her braided hair.
We're going to be very happy.
The end. This has been Take a Ride with Me by Kara Joy, narrated by Kay Meyer. All rights reserved.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.